Zoom for the second day of our conference on reading the New Testament within Judaism. We devoted the first day of our conference to the Paul within Judaism perspective. More than 200 people attended the session. Over 400 people, additional people, followed our session on YouTube, and the numbers are still growing. Today, the conversation will first focus again on the Paul within Judaism perspective, sort of recap session. We have asked Paula Fredriksen to give us some remarks about what happened yesterday, and then there will be a short conversation that could include other people that were protagonist speakers of the meeting yesterday. Reading Paul within Judaism, as we have repeated yesterday, means that he should no longer be seen as the destroyer of Judaism, nor as the one who emancipated Christianity from Judaism, but as part of a diversity of Second Temple Judaism. There is a radical difference whether we listen to Paul's original and even polemical voice as coming from within a family he never abandoned, or from outside a family he did abandon. Paul's belief in Jesus as the Messiah did not make him an apostate, but a representative of a distinct group within Second Temple Judaism. Paul was born, lived, and died a Jew. The religion of Israel was his religion, not his former religion. So I have synthesized the meeting of yesterday in a post I published on Facebook earlier this morning. But now we would like to listen from Paula Fredriksen about her feedback from yesterday's session. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you, Gabriella. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so Isaac Oliver began the session by mentioning three conversation points that we're bearing in mind as we investigate this question of Paul within Judaism. What are the criteria for treating a text, whether the text is within Judaism or without Judaism? Should New Testament texts be considered within Judaism? And if they are, how does that change interpretation? I wanted to say several things. At points, the conversation seemed to veer between wondering whether a text was within Judaism or whether the ethnicity of the author was specifically Jewish. And that's something that it's a question that comes up in different ways. For example, if we treat the criteria that somebody is engaged with the text of the Septuagint and is insisting that he is part of Israel, that lets Justin Martyr in the door, which seems prima facie to be a mistake if you think of the dialogue with Trypho. And that's why I would like to emphasize the connection between, and I have to use two different terms because of where we are, but they wouldn't have been two different terms in antiquity. The immediate connection between religion and ethnicity, where gods themselves, I've argued that Paul calls God the God of the Jews also. So traditional gods are ethnic and local in antiquity, and the Jewish God pre-destruction of the temple is ethnic and local, as well as being universal and transcendent. That's one of the idiosyncratic ideas of Judaism, that it's both a universal God and an ethnically specific God. So I think the ethnicity issue has to be something we foreground. Of course, then there's a question of how do you, I mean, if modern Judaism hasn't decided on who is a Jew, then good luck to us in Mediterranean antiquity. So if a Christian group, a Christ group, self-identifies as Jewish, does that make it within Judaism? Again, if Justin is claiming to be the true Israel, or if Origen is claiming that Christians are the true Israel, does that make them within Judaism? Obviously, to me, obviously not. I mean, Origen says specifically that Israel is a nation of souls, and Jerusalem is a city in heaven. So that that seems to be pretty outside of Judaism for me. Everybody was cognizant of the way that the extreme diversity of Second Temple Judaism compounds the problem of definition that we're all striving toward. But I thought that this completely correct observation complicated the question that kept coming up about if Paul is Torah observant, which is one of the contested issues about seeing how far within Judaism Paul is. If he is Torah observant, why does he get the 39 lashes in 2 Corinthians 11:24? The issue of Paul's personal law observance seems to cause frisson of anxiety. I'm not sure why. It's seen as something that's unlikely by a lot of people who still see Paul within Judaism as a hermeneutical rubric. I just want to point out that given all of the Jews in Second Temple Judaism in the diaspora who were members of town councils, who were members of foreign militaries, who were ephebes, who were studying with curriculum gorged with gods, and whose names show up in steles dedicated to Hermes and Hercules. If everybody would have been being beaten by with the 39 lashes if the issue of varieties of observance were a problem. So I think that this issue of Paul receiving 39 lashes has nothing to do with the question of Torah observance or what style of Torah observance or how much Torah observance. We don't have a normative definition of Torah observance in this period. What we have is varieties. But I think the issue of 39 lashes, as I've argued, there tends to be this this way of looking at it as it must have been some kind of, quote, religious offense. I've argued that it's a social offense because Paul is endangering synagogue communities in specific localities by urging local ex-pagan pagans to stop showing respect to the gods who are presiding over the well-being of the city. That's something that destabilizes the position of the synagogue because there would obviously be only one place in town where a message of making exclusive commitment to the God of Israel would be coming from, and that's the synagogue. So I think, again, getting away from a theological focus on this would be helpful for trying to imagine why Paul receives this disciplinary action. I've also made the case that by urging Gentiles or urging pagans to become ex-pagans by making an exclusive commitment to the God of Israel, and also by assuming idealized Jewish behaviors, and by receiving the pneuma of Christ, which is specifically in order to enable them to keep the law, Paul says, although they don't have to keep as much as the law as Israel does because they're not part of that particular covenant. What he's doing is, by the ancient term, he's advocating Judaizing. He's telling these pagans to become ex-pagans by acting like Jews in several respects, which is what ancient Judaizing meant, just like ancient Midaizing meant acting somewhat like a Persian, or Romanizing meant acting somewhat like a Roman, or Hellenizing meant acting somewhat like a Jew. So it's something that's specifically addressed to outsiders. That, I think, does not make Gentiles part of Israel. they're entering into a new lineage via Abraham. But again, this is something where Jason Staples and I disagree. Paul is calling these people ethne right up to the very end, at the edge of the end of the epistle to the Romans in Romans 15 and Romans 16. The nations rejoice with Israel, but they don't become part of Israel. Israel is a covenanted community that has all those polythetic ethnic identifiers that are listed in Romans 9, 4 through 5. And there's a distinction between being brought into the covenant with Abraham and being brought within the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, with all the different promises that represents. That's Stanley Stauer's old point. Okay, so Gentiles do not become Israel. Another issue that took a lot of time to address yesterday is the status of 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 through 16. Is it original to Paul, or is it an interpolation? Berger Pearson at Harvard Theological Review in 1971 laid out the case for its being an interpolation. There's, first of all, the trail of blood motif, which is very strong in Matthew and very strong in Justin Martyr. And it's something that seems to obtrude in this passage in Paul. The accusation of universal Jewish misanthropy is a standing pagan critique of Judaism. And the other thing I thought about is that this passage accuses diaspora Jews as well as Judean Jews because they hinder Paul going to the Gentiles. So it's a kind of universal condemnation of Jews, not just of Judean Jews. So for all those reasons, I incline to see this as an interpolation. It's true that no manuscript omits these verses, but the manuscripts that include it go back only to the 4th century, by which time who knows how many interpolations are coming into the Gospels and the letters. And we know from the redactional history with Gospels and with, say, for example, the Corinthian correspondence, that things have gotten messed up and rearranged and edited in the 3.5 centuries before we actually have manuscripts of this period. Okay, so if pagans are becoming ex-pagans by becoming mitigated Torah observers, I would say that Paul's evocation of Leviticus 19, that loving the neighbor fulfills the law, he's urging them to fulfill the law, but that's a form of Judaizing. It's not a form of, they're adopted sons. They're not covenanted sons, the way covenanted sons stand in the huiothesia of Romans 9:4. So those are my thoughts as well. It came up that John Barclay and Tom Wright's Paul is also within Judaism. I was baffled by that description. I don't see how that's the case. And the other standing question was if Judaism or if Torah observance had continued validity for Paul. And I would say that he does. And one of the papers emphasized how Paul makes negative and positive statements about the law, which affects the consideration of the continued validity of Torah. Again, that's something that John Gager spelled out in 1981 with Reinventing Paul, where he starts the book with the list of the positive and the negative statements. And if you take seriously Paul's own claim that his intended audience are his ex-pagan listeners, then a lot of that issue dissolves, which means it should be a gentler thought to think that Paul himself is Torah observant in his way as Jews were in their way. So those are my summary remarks, and yeah, that's all I have to say, Gabriele. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would like to invite people that yesterday contributed, or Isaac. I see already also Jim McGrath that was not one of the panelists, but has followed the panel. Do you want also, Jim, to say something about in reaction to what also Paula said?
I'm sure that like everyone else, I'm mostly want to express gratitude. Appreciate your effort to get the nuance of how Paul understood himself, and how we can think about him. I think the fact that questions of Jewish identity are not settled even in the present day, is an important context for this. The other thing that I think, I hope will come up as we discuss the other works about Mark and Revelation, that for Paul, the covenant with Abraham, that he views Gentiles as being grafted into, and so views them as adopted children of Abraham, is not the same thing as the covenant with Israel. In fact, the whole emphasis on not under Torah is part of that. And so just appreciate the way you brought clarity to a number of things that came up both in presentations yesterday and in the chat. Have lots of notes from yesterday's session as well, and there's just so much there that's rich. I'm sure we'll be returning to many of those themes today.
Thanks, Jim. Isaac, I would like to say something while we are inviting the panelists of yesterday to raise their hand for adding some comments.
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and then I see Paul Sloan has his hand raised, so we'll let Paul speak after that. I mean, some things that stood out for me is one, the importance of also engaging with non-canonical texts. Justin Martyr, Origen were brought up yesterday in the discussion. And thankfully, in the fall, part 2 of this conference, we are going to dedicate discussions to extra-canonical writings. I think it's important to address that. In relation to what Paula Fredriksen brought up today, the issue of ethnicity, that is key, I think, in discussing writings by authors such as Justin Martyr. The other important point that came up, I think, at the end was the ethical implications. Bernadette Rudin really brought that to the forefront, and we need to continue to reflect on that matter with relation to, for example, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. Whether it's an interpolation or not, we still have to, wrestle with the implications of what we do here as an academic society. As far as the 39 lashes, that came up a lot as well. And I just threw out 3 possibilities there for brainstorming. One is the possibility that Paula has raised. Paul is some kind of troublemaker in the sense of drawing away these Gentiles from their ancestral customs, from their ancestral gods. And this is disruptive. This is something socially disruptive, especially for Jewish communities in the diaspora who are minorities and want to maintain a status quo so that there's some kind of modus vivendi that is being upset by Paul. Another possibility I throw out there is maybe blasphemy. I'm just throwing that out because Metatron, I was reading about Metatron again recently. He also gets whipped. Apparently for not for upsetting the powers that be in heaven. Not that the 2 powers in heaven per se was something blasphemous, but I do wonder whether claiming that a certain human is son of God, is in some way equal to the Israelite God, would have been blasphemous or scandalous to Jews. For all they knew, Jesus was dead. He was crucified on the cross. So not so much the claim that there are other divinities as a blasphemous belief, but the claim that this particular Jew from Nazareth has this high divine status. If that could have led to Paul receiving punishment by local Jewish authorities. After all, this is something that other followers of Jesus, or at least Jesus himself, was accused of during his trial, a complicated scene that I think is going to come up today in some of the presentations that deal with Mark. So I could say some more things, but in interest of time, I'll let Paul chime in because his hand has been raised.
Thanks.
Paul.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Paula, for that summary. That was really helpful. Just 2 points on the one. I've often wondered if something from 1 Corinthians 15 can help with the 39 lashes, where he says, you know, if Christ is not raised, then we've been bearing false testimony about God. In other words, we've been claiming that God has done something that he hasn't, if he hasn't in fact raised Christ. And so if they disagree with the proposition that Christ is raised, then they would be able to leverage against Paul the claim that, hey, you're saying God did something and he didn't. And if Paul calls that false testimony against God, that could be something that would be subject to a kind of discipline. I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud on that. I also don't know what's going on with the lashes. And I agree with Paula's point about the variety of Torah observance, making it questionable whether that's the precise issue that's going on there, but I don't know either. And I just wanted to clarify one point. I was the presenter who made the point about Barclay and Wright, and I just wanted to clarify. I was talking. I also agree that they would not be considered within the conversation that we're having about Pauline Judaism. Their scholarship would not be within that particular field. My point was to raise the question of the utility of the label once those scholars themselves would also claim that what they're doing is within Judaism. So because Wright would say that his reading of Paul is one that should be considered within Judaism because of his definition of Judaism, and same for Barclay, because he would say that his scholarship is precisely, presenting Paul as a Jew who's doing all this Jewish stuff, even if his Jewishness is now redefined. It would say, my point is not that, they should be included within this particular, what we're now calling within Judaism. It's at that point the label itself might be is just has to be recognized as a heuristic device to now label a kind of scholarship that's being done over against what these scholars might themselves claim. Because I agree they're coming to very different conclusions. Totally agree with that.
Right. I think that if I could
Certainly.
Paul's point, Paul made 2 excellent points yesterday. One is how we imagine the, quote, obverse of Judaism, if we're trying to get that term, which is a heuristic term. It's a non-native concept to antiquity, any kind of ism, right? If we imagine the obverse of Judaism to be Gentile or to be specifically Christian. And as Paul pointed out, it's the labels that we use that shape the expectation of what is possible for our historical reconstructions. And that's why I think, again, the virtue of looking at our whole endeavor as Paul within Judaism is rhetorical. It's more elegant than saying Paul within Jewishness or something like that. But Judaism implies a sort of translocal uniformity, which we absolutely know did not exist. There was no central authority to enforce any kind of translocal uniformity. People were doing improvisations all over the place, and we can't, if we don't consider an ephebe outside of Judaism, right, just because he's an ephebe. I mean, even Philo's nephew was considered somebody who didn't remain loyal to his ancestral traditions, but that he still wasn't, the fact that he was being complained about means that even he wasn't considered outside of Judaism, or he wouldn't have been the scandal that he was. So again, the issue of our own rubric is what's complicating our own efforts.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Jim, I see you raise your hand again.
Yeah, I don't know whether, Paula, you did it consciously or just as a way of speaking, but you talked about whether Paul was within Judaism or without Judaism. And I really like that phrase, right? Because we normally use without Judaism, not so much in terms of being outside of it as lacking it. And so I feel like there's it may not help us bring clarity to this topic, but I feel like there's a good name either for a book or a conference there. Paul within Judaism, without Judaism, ? Or something like that.
Thank you. Thank you. John Van Maren, I saw you wrote something on the chat. I would like to repeat it yes.
Yeah, just noting that there's also an argument that the 39 lashes aren't happening in diaspora synagogues, at least based on the analogy with other Greek and Roman associations, where they don't have any punishments that are corporeal in any way, just fines. And so that, of course, doesn't mean that it can't be happening, but the comparison suggests that maybe it's not happening there, maybe it's happening in Jerusalem. I just want to throw that out there as another contribution, recent contribution to the understanding of the 39 lashes.
Thank you. And John, you are just introducing, okay, the new session. Thank you, Paula, very much for your words. This is certainly a conversation that will go on and on and on in the next months and years. And now we are moving quickly to the second part and most central part of our conference today, which is a discussion about Mark within Judaism. Again, question mark, okay, at the end. Mark, I must say, John, that has been a gospel that, unlike Luke or Matthew, has been a little bit less studied under this new perspective. So we are very, very curious to start this conversation. And of course, we want all of us, we want to congratulate you for your new volume on the subject that certainly is opening new important perspectives in the study of the Gospel of Mark in particular. So we are really very, very curious to see the kind of discussion that could emerge today. We have 3 hours, a large number of distinguished panelists. So as the director of the Enoch Seminar, my final responsibility in this 30 minutes that introduce the session on Mark within Judaism is to thank all of you for joining this session, for working so hard for preparing this session. I would like to remind, as yesterday, we have a very large number of people that have joined the conference. So we are very, very pleased with the outcome, with the participation for the attendance of people for today. Of course, there will be a possibility, we are recording the session, so will be a possibility for everybody also to see, to listen to our session later on. I know also that there are many people that are following us on YouTube, so I also welcome all of them. As I would like to repeat my plea for supporting the activities of the Enoch Seminar. I would like to invite all of you to become members of the Enoch Seminar, because this will allow us to continue to offer these conferences free of charge. But we rely on free donations from all people that are interested in the subject. So I would like really to invite all of you and all the people that are in attendance to consider even a very small donation of $5 or more to the Enoch Seminar, so that we may continue in our mission of providing a space for scholars, specialists from all around the world to discuss topics, matters that are of common interest. So please a donation is not only appreciated, is also very much needed. Okay, John, it's your turn now as the chair of a session on Mark within Judaism.
Thank you, Gabriella, and thank you, Isaac, for organizing this, and for all of you for being here. I can say I'm also curious about what will come out of this session. This is the largest session that I've been a part of, and I think that has happened, centered around this question and the Gospel of Mark. And we have a lot of people who have a lot to contribute from different perspectives, who are going to be with us today. And so I'm excited. I'm sharing it. We have 11 different people with contributions. I'm going to give a short little introduction, and then we'll talk about some logistics of how we'll move forward, and it should go just great. So I'm going to talk mostly about framing the question, the background, the history of research on this question, and a couple possible implications, and then a couple ideas from my recent book, which Gabriella mentioned, which just came out in February, just to kind of get some ideas out there to chew on. And of course, a lot more come with all of the different contributors. So here's my little introduction. When we think about the evolving paradigm of reading New Testament texts within Judaism, or let's say rediscovering the Jewishness of the New Testament, so a broader category, the Gospel of Mark comes relatively late to the party. I'm aware of two essays, state of the question essays, prompted by the interest, both scholarly and more broadly, in rediscovering the Jewishness of Jesus and the New Testament, an interest often attributed to a new sensitivity to Jewish-Christian relations after the horrors of the Shoah, and as some have pointed out, correlates closest to the shift in Western perceptions of the state of Israel from a liability to a strategic ally after the June 1967 and October 1973 wars. In the first of these two essays, Daniel Harrington, in 2004, begins an essay titled, "How Jewish Was Mark's Gospel?" by asking, why raise this question? And then answering, one reason is that it has seldom been raised, and so it deserves to be raised. He then goes on to contrast recent scholarship on the Gospel of Mark with scholarship on the Jewishness of the other Gospels. Harrington concludes that it is fair to call the Gospel of Mark a Jewish text based on many readings that today would be considered traditional. Harrington, but he doesn't have any real theorization of what would or would not make a text Jewish, much of which we discussed yesterday. In 2016, Larry Wills wrote a short piece titled "The Jewishness of the Gospel of Mark." In it, he summarized scholarship by noting that while a great continuity with Judaism was found in one New Testament text after another, there was one very important exception, the Gospel of Mark. The earliest of the Gospels, and therefore the closest in time to Jesus, seem to remain in the Gentile fold. Today, interest seems to be growing, though the interpretive implications of reading the Gospel of Mark within Judaism are only beginning to emerge. In a survey of 90 monographs on the Gospel of Mark published in the last 25 years, I found that 52 of these position the Gospel of Mark as depicting a non-Jewish or post-Jewish form of Christ following, especially based on the writer's purported interest in the good news going to non-Jews and the purported rejection of large parts of the law of Moses. Most of the other studies surveyed do not address the positionality of the text in relationship to Judaism, leaving just 3 of the 90 monographs that push back in any meaningful way against the scholarly depiction of the Gospel of Mark as a Gentile gospel. And these are by Richard Horsley, Maureen Sabine, and James Crossley. However, in my research, I have also found a bunch of scattered essays and articles that take what we can call a within Judaism starting point to interpret specific texts or themes. And some of these are written by our panelists. And I really like this idea as a sort of centering point for the within Judaism paradigm. It as a starting point, as a counterbalance to the historically dominant assumption that they are Christian and therefore not Jewish. I think that's one of the best contributions. And in addition, I've also found a number of, or I haven't found them, a number of books about the earliest traditions of Jesus. And so not specifically Mark, but they put substantial weight on the text of Mark as the earliest gospel. they take a within Judaism starting point. I'm thinking especially of Matthew Thiessen's Jesus and the Forces of Death, the Gospel's portrayal of ritual impurity within first century Judaism, 2020, and Paul Sloan, who we heard from yesterday and just a few minutes ago, his forthcoming book, Jesus and the Law of Moses, the Gospels and the Restoration of Israel within first century Judaism, expected August of 2025. There are a number of other monographs in process that will soon add to this project. In other words, the Gospel of Mark seems to have joined the party. Two things before we get to our panelists. First, possible implications for a reconstruction of the earliest Jesus movement, if Mark is within Judaism, setting aside all the definitional questions for the moment. Reconstructions of the historical Jesus have often argued that Jesus limited his mission to the Jews and/or Israel, that he observed and assumed the importance of the law of Moses, and that he proclaimed the good news of a final national restoration of Israel, among other things. These arguments are usually made by reading behind Mark, on the assumption that Mark presents a different story. When Mark is read within Judaism, and if the above interpretations are correct, then the earliest extant narrative of Jesus may also depict such a Jesus and reflects a writer and intended audience with similar assumptions and expectations, perhaps 4 decades later or so. Further, when the Gospel of Matthew is understood to promote a version of Judaism, the writer of Matthew is most often understood to react against Mark by correcting what was found to be inadequate or problematic. The two most consequential differences are taken to be their views on the law and, again, Jesus's Gentile mission. On this reconstruction, Matthew's main source is a Gentile gospel that Matthew reworks for a Jewish group of Christ followers. This leads to a reconstruction where the author and intended audience of Matthew are a marginal Jewish group on the boundaries of a burgeoning Gentile Christian movement, usually. Situating Mark within Judaism suggests that Matthew clarifies and expands Mark's story, but does not react against it. It also suggests that Matthew is less marginal and perhaps more mainstream among early Jesus followers. When Isaac Oliver's work on Luke Acts is added to the picture, the entire synoptic tradition potentially promotes a form of Judaism, or 3 forms or something like this, or varieties of Judaism. Second, what might a reading of the whole Gospel of Mark look like if we start with the presupposition that the writer depicts a form of Judaism, rather than the alternative hypothesis? Here I note just a couple conclusions from my recent book, which attempts such a reading, though I'm not going to discuss the relevant texts in detail here for the sake of time, of course. I argue that the writer of Mark depicts Jesus not setting aside the Levitical dietary and/or purity laws, but systematizing them, and taking the specific scattered statements in the Law of Moses about these systems and summarizing them, systematizing them into a thing that's usable and applicable. More generally, law observance is the basic requirement for entrance into Jesus's proclaimed approaching kingdom, which will arrive on the earth when he, as the Son of Man, returns in power in the clouds. This kingdom is, I argue, a nationally restored, if transformed, Israel centered in the ancestral homeland, and the writer expected it within a generation. That is, long before now. A crucial part of us discerning the writer's expectation of this kingdom is the pervasive echoes of expectations of national restoration from Israel's ancestral memories or their scriptures, expectations which the writer does not reinterpret for a new non-ethnic group after the rejection and crucifixion of Jesus, but I argue anticipates its fulfillment in the, let's say, more direct sense when the Son of Man returns. The expected inhabitants of this approaching kingdom are basically Israel, as the story shows no real interest in the nations, either during the narrated ministry of Jesus or in the expectations of the future. Those elements typically understood to depict a mission to the nations by Jesus, and also among his earliest followers after his departure, I argue, make better narrative sense as part of a theme of regathering scattered Israel. These ideas, which I argue for, are just some aspects of a possible reading of the Gospel of Mark within Judaism, but I'm sure our panelists will have other thoughts, and so let's go there. Just a couple logistical things. Our structure is a little bit different than yesterday's. We have 3 panelists who will each begin with a 10-minute contribution. After that, then we have 8 discussants who will in some way interact with those, but also have their own contributions in just 5 minutes each. And so very short, just teasers that we can then talk about. And like yesterday, the live discussion will wait until after everybody has given their contribution. But we're welcome to have a running conversation in the chat as we go along. I also have Megan. Maybe she's already done this or will. It's going to provide a Google link to a document that lists relevant publications by the participants today that are in some way related to our topic. And so that's a good place to start, I think, if you want to get into the topic more. And I think that's everything we need. I do want to emphasize at the beginning, we're going to try really hard to stick to the time. So 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and I'll provide reminders. Anything else that I'm missing from anyone before we jump into our panelists?
No, I think John is perfect, and just also reminding the people in attendance to use the chat to express their comments, their questions. You don't have to wait until the end. We like to have a conversation, a parallel conversation also in the chat.
Okay, well then on to our panelists. Our first panelist today is Professor Helen Bond, currently Dean of the University of Edinburgh School of Divinity. So I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much to John and all the organisers. I'm just starting my stopwatch, so I keep to time. I should say I'm no longer Dean. I'm happily undeaned, so I'm just a normal professor, or at least a professor of Christian origins. That's all I am now. Anyway, as John was saying, and similar to what he was saying, I was always taught that Mark was a Gentile gospel. Even if the author was of Jewish heritage and shows a close engagement with the Jewish scriptures and the story of Israel, he approves of a universal mission to Gentiles and addresses himself to an audience that has moved away from the synagogue and now regards Jews as somehow other. When it came to the Passion narrative, I was told that the negativity towards the Jewish leaders displayed there was the result of several decades of antagonism between the Jewish synagogue and Christ followers, and that this contemporary hostility had been retrojected back into the story of Jesus. Recently, however, I've started to question all of that. I'm writing a commentary on Mark at the moment for a new OUP series and having to think carefully about where to situate the gospel. Like most people in today's group, I imagine, I've become sceptical of any clear break between what we call Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other, certainly as early as the 1st century. The works of Stephen Katz, Judith Liu, Daniel Boyarin, Adam Becker and Annette Yoshiko Reed, among many others, several of whom of course are here today, has argued persuasively for a much muddier, messier, lengthier picture than we'd all previously assumed. Now, I date Mark after the destruction of Jerusalem. The preoccupation with the temple in this work, both the prophecies of its destruction and the way it forms a setting for much of the second half, suggests to me that Mark was written post-70, and so it should be read within this context, as a Jewish Christ follower trying to make sense of the fall of the temple. In human terms, the Roman victory over the Jews was nothing short of a catastrophe. All played out against a backdrop of increasing Roman presence in the land of Israel and ostentatious Flavian attempts in Rome to justify their seizure of the imperial throne. But the fall of the temple had profound theological implications too, as Jews, both at home and in the diaspora, sought to make sense of what seemed to be God's abandonment of his people. How could God have let this happen? Was the Jewish God really inferior to Roman deities, as their victory seemed to suggest? And where did all of this leave God's covenant with Israel? There's no reason to imagine that Christ followers, such as the author of Mark's Gospel, felt any of this less keenly than their fellow Jews. Jerusalem and its temple was central to the earliest believers, including those in the diaspora where Mark's Gospel was likely written. It was to Jerusalem, after all, that all would be gathered in the last days, certainly according to Romans 15, citing Isaiah 11. The disaster then cried out for explanation, from Christ followers as much as from other Jews. What had gone wrong? We're lucky to have a lot of Jewish literature from this period, as various voices tried to make sense of the situation. Strikingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, many of them draw parallels with the fall of the first temple to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Interestingly, both temples were believed to have fallen on the very same day, already making links between the two events. The biblical accounts provided a wealth of personnel, Jeremiah, Baruch and Ezra, symbols and images by which to understand the more recent tragedy. Some works, like 4 Ezra or 2 Baruch, express themselves in apocalyptic language. Others drew on the Gentile tradition of Sibylline prophecy, which was particularly popular in the East. I'm thinking of the Sibylline oracles 4 and 5 here. And Josephus cast his account of the Jewish war as a Greco-Roman history. But whatever literary approach they employed, all of these works maintained that the temple had fallen not because of the strength of Rome or its gods, but for the same reason that it had fallen to the Babylonians centuries earlier, because the Jewish God had punished the nation for its sin. The precise source of this sin is not always clear. Some works are content just to talk about general impiety, for example, 4th Ezra. Others, however, are more specific. 2 Baruch pins blame on the priests, while 4 Baruch blames those who advocated accommodation to Rome. In his much lengthier Jewish war, Josephus blames the revolutionaries. The beginning of the end, he maintains, was the murder of the high priest Ananus by the Zealots. The capture of the city began with the death of Ananus, he writes. And I have to thank my former PhD student, Nathaniel Vetti, for bringing this particular death to my attention. And in an attempt to explain the earlier Roman conquest of Judea in 63 BCE, the author of the Psalms of Solomon similarly laid the blame squarely on the aristocratic priesthood, accusing them in graphic terms of sexual misconduct and defilement of the temple. As with the other texts considered here, the unknown author singles out a particular group with whom he disagrees and declares them responsible for the tragedy that has befallen the nation. It's interesting how often, too, in all of this, it's the priestly leadership that gets the blame. So it's within this Deuteronomistic understanding of the link between sin and divine retribution, I suggest, that we need to understand Mark's treatment of the Jewish aristocratic priesthood. If asked to account for the calamity, Mark would have a ready answer. The temple fell because the Jewish priestly leaders not only failed to recognize God's Son, but engineered his death. The link is dramatically made by the tearing of the temple veil as Jesus breathes his last. But it's also explained parabolically in the story of the vineyard in chapter 12. The issue here isn't about a supersessionist transfer of God's blessings from Jews to Gentiles, as is often claimed, but rather an attempt to identify the reasons for God's vengeance. Simply put, the aristocratic leaders have betrayed the trust placed in them, killed the owner's son, and thereby incurred God's punishment. The temple, as their centre of operations, will be destroyed. And of course, there are many parallels with Jeremiah here too. Situating Mark's Gospel in the post-70 period and blurring the boundaries between Jews and Christians at this early period, allows us to put its author in an environment where many other Jews were wrestling with the theological consequences of the destruction of the Holy City and its temple, and asking how to mend and renew the special relationship between God and his people. Like others, Mark sees the destruction as part of God's wider actions in history. It's as well to remember that there is nothing particularly anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic in his casting blame for the tragedy on a particular group of Jews. Ordinary Jews, of course, are portrayed in a generally favourable light in this gospel. Where Mark is distinctive when compared with other Jewish literature from this period, however, is in seeing the events of 70 CE as intimately connected with the arrival of God's Messiah and the refusal of the Jewish leaders to accept him. His work reassures his Christ-believing audience, from both Jewish and Gentile backgrounds and everything in between, that these terrible events were all part of God's plan, that they are, in fact, the beginning of the end times, and that God will soon arrive to establish his kingdom. In the meantime, they should continue to trust in Jesus Christ, God's Son, whose death renewed the covenant with God and whose life, as set out in Mark's biography, offers a model of service and obedience for their own. Thank you.
Thank you, and you even beat my timer. Our next presenter is Heidrun Mader from the University of Cologne. Heidrun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, for the invitation. I'm going to start so that I'll keep the 10 minutes. I'm talking about Mark's universalistic approach within Judaism. So I do think that the gospel is also directed to the Gentiles, but I'm going to try to also situate that into Judaism. So I think it is important to ask how specifically the earliest gospel at our hands was written within Judaism, or how to characterize the gospel of Mark's Judaism, to phrase it more precisely with John von Maurens' words. Of course, we are dealing with the Jewish world of thought when we are dealing with the earliest Christ-related literature. However, within this Judaism, it makes sense in my view to look at the forward development. To which extent was Christ-related Judaism ready to include Gentiles? Because this is where the development was moving towards. Being Jewish and looking at how to include Gentiles into salvation were, of course, no oppositions. There have been many studies on how Judaism included Gentiles. I want to pick out Anders Runeson's study on Judaism for Gentiles, published in 2022, specifically his suggestions on how to differentiate between the terms of particularism and universalism in a better way that does not, in a worst-case scenario, designate Judaism as particularistic with a negative connotation and Christianity as universalistic with a positive connotation. In my book, Mark and Paul, I have discussed that Mark deals with universalism in a similar way as the Jewish Christ believer Paul does. I will only outline my points here briefly, points that also have been argued by others, and then I will, after that, I will focus on the Syrophoenician woman. First of all, the term gospel is defined by both Paul and Mark with a universalistic scope. The gospel reaches out to the whole world, Mark 13:10 and 14:9, and thus addresses both Jews and Gentiles and everybody in between, as Helen just said. The two feeding stories are the narrative's pillars that show that Jesus' messianic work progresses to include Gentiles as well. First, it addresses Israel, when in Mark 6, Jesus feeds the crowds on Jewish land with figures and details symbolizing Israel. And then in Mark 8, he also feeds the Gentiles on land that is not characterized as particularly Jewish, again with figures and other narrative details symbolizing a Gentile context. This universal feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8 includes Gentiles, the 12, representing Israel, and Jesus himself giving messianic bread to everyone. A table for everyone, for Israel and the nations, including Peter, unlike in the Antioch incident of Galatians 2. Another important text in which the Mark and Jesus communicates to Gentiles his view of the Jewish law, more specifically here the dietary laws, is Mark 7, where Jesus redefines the dietary laws so that the universalistic feeding of the crowds in the following chapter in Mark 8 can actually take place. According to Anders Runeson's categories, we would say that Mark here, like Paul, shifts from the category of an open ethnic religion, meaning that an ethnic group and its religious identity are closely tied together, yet conversation of outsiders is possible, to a next category that Runeson calls a non-ethnic religion, in which ethnic identifiers are not religiously valid. And Runeson sees that all these positions and categories he names are all part of Judaism, actually are all found in Judaism. The emphasis is on the religion's non-ethnic character, but ethnicities are still part of the community's mindset and thus have to be taken into account. Looking at Runeson's categories and asking whether a position is inclusive or exclusive, I hold that Mark here takes an inclusive position, meaning that there is a possibility of salvation also for people who don't belong to the ethnic in-group. Salvation is not reserved to members only. Having explained my view on Mark's universal approach here very briefly, I want to look at the story that follows the text about the dietary laws in Mark 7, namely the story about Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman that has always been prominent when discussing the Mark and Jesus' position towards Gentiles. In my discussion of the intertextuality between the Mark narrative of the Greek Syrophoenician woman and the Pauline reflections in Romans 9 to 11, particularly the olive tree metaphor, I emphasized that the significance of the proton, the first, referring to Israel. Israel comes first. This term gains its weight from a paranetic communicative situation, both in the epistle to the Romans and in this passage in the Gospel of Mark. Addressees of pagan origin are admonished not to be arrogant toward fellow Christ believers of Jewish origin. Gentile Christ believers have to acknowledge that Israel's salvation chronologically comes first, and thus treat their fellow Jewish Christ believers with respect. Another aspect of this narrative I have brought forward is that it shows in density how the opening towards the Gentiles evolved up to the time of the gospel narrative. Some Christ believers hesitated to open up to the Gentiles and to let them eat at the same table. The pagan woman, however, insists and really wants to be part of the messianic salvation. This persistent interest of believers of pagan background might have impressed Jewish Christ believers. The persistent desire to be included in the salvation of the God of Israel and his Messiah could have been a motivation for spreading the gospel amongst Gentiles. Thus, I don't think that Gentile listeners were put off by the story, in which Jesus at first is rude and harsh against Gentiles. Instead, Gentiles could identify with what happened and could be encouraged to stay persistent in their belief to gain messianic salvation. They could be pleased to see that the Greek woman impresses Jesus with her persistence. Let me bring Terence Donaldson's three well-known Jewish positions to the table. First, a Jewish position that expects the destruction of the Gentiles in the end of times. Second, a position that envisions Gentiles supporting Israel and standing alongside Israel. And thirdly, one that imagines the Gentiles fully participating in Israel's salvation. Gentile Sabomenoi will have made diverse experiences in interacting with Judaism and also early Christian groups, being treated as unclean ones and thus rejected on the one hand. On the other, they will have encountered welcome gestures and true openness for them to participate in Jewish life. Thus, I don't see that this Markan story comes as a surprising shock to Gentile ears, but that it mirrors the ambivalent experiences and reinforces them to keep being persistent if Christ-believing communities try to exclude them or downgrade them. Today, I want to bring a new aspect to the interpretation of the story, looking at this change in the text from Jesus' harshness towards the Gentile woman to his opening up towards her and integrating her and her daughter into his messianic salvation. This change has often been noted in the research history of this story. I want to show that this change from a harsh position to an open position finds a parallel in the Psalm of Solomon, 17, a messianic psalm of Second Temple Judaism. In the context of Mark within Judaism, Jesus' change in his reaction to the Greek woman can be understood against the Jewish background of Mark. The wide spectrum of eschatological views in Jewish literature is reflected in the brief pericope of the Syrophoenician woman. Jesus' harsh reaction of the woman's request and his labeling of the Gentiles as dogs, unworthy to sit at the table of salvation, represents an exclusionary position within Second Temple Judaism. I could apply Runerson's category of a salvation exclusionist position, which means that the boundaries of a religious membership are also the boundaries of salvation. Jesus' position at first also seems to be that of a closed ethnic religion, another one of Runerson's categories. And then, in contrast, Jesus' acceptance of the woman's counterstatement represents a shift towards an open position, to an open ethnic religion and salvation-inclusive religion. The healing of her daughter shows the full integration into messianic salvation. The coexistence of both positions in a single text is not unique to Mark 7. It also appears in Psalm 17 of the Psalms of Solomon. In this prayer, the rejection of the Gentiles is voiced at first, followed by the eschatological inclusion in Israel's salvation. In Psalm Solomon 17, the Messiah first destroys the law-breaking Gentiles with the word of his mouth, verse 24. But after having gathered the tribes of his holy Laos, having judged them and purified them, verse 26, the Messiah also gathers and judges the nations. He, the Messiah, will be their king, and together with the purified Jerusalem, the nations will glorify God, and God will be merciful to them. The sequence is mirrored in our story in Mark 7. Jesus, in his first response, counters the woman's request with the word of his mouth. But then, Jesus has pronounced that Israel comes first. After Jesus has pronounced that Israel comes first, and when it has become clear that the woman accepts Israel's coming first, and after she proclaims Jesus is kurios and obviously believes that his bread means salvation, Jesus purifies her daughter, which the narrator even calls child at the end of the story in verse 30. In Psalm 17, the Gentiles who are Israel's enemies are destroyed. But those Gentiles who acknowledge Israel and its God are integrated into God's salvation with the Messiah as their king. Thus, Psalm Solomon 17 shows that the Messiah has integrating force and moves to a salvation-inclusive position. The Greek woman in Mark 7 shares the messianic hope of the psalmist. She acknowledges that Israel comes first and proclaims that Jesus is the Lord. Thus, Jesus' approach towards her changes, like in Psalm 17 and Psalm Solomon 17. The Messiah, the change of approach towards the Gentiles due to the attitude towards Israel and the Messiah, and the motives of purification and of Jews and Gentiles glorifying God together, all these are motives that the Psalm and the Markan story have in common. Jesus' reaction towards the woman can be explained against the backdrop of an analogous position in Second Temple Messianic Judaism. And the Markan narration pushes into the same direction as Psalm 17 does. After God's holy Laos has been gathered, like Jesus gathered the 12 in Mark 3, in a second step, those Gentiles are accepted who acknowledge that Israel comes first and who recognize the Messiah. In a third step, they glorify God in the words of the psalmist, or in the words of the Markan narrative, which tells the readers in the text following the Syrophoenician woman that the people of the Decapolis praise Jesus exceedingly for his messianic deeds. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And the parallel with Psalm of Solomon 17 is interesting. I'll have to look at that more. Thank you. Our next panelist, our third of three panelists, is Professor Elizabeth Shively from Baylor University. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I am going to look at Mark's compositional practices and argue that they are rooted in Judaism. And so I'm going to stick pretty closely for my guidance to 3 questions that were provided to us. So first of all, just why does Mark belong within Judaism? And I want to, again, argue that the gospel's most important roots are Jewish. Mark is deeply embedded in Jewish scripture, theology, and methods of interpretation. The first question, why consider Mark within Judaism? Well, Mark certainly shows awareness of Greco-Roman literary culture, emphasizing that too strongly can risk missing something essential, which is that Mark is grounded in Jewish literary strategies and scriptural imagination. Richard Hayes, in his influential and I think very important book, Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels, speaks about an interpretive revolution in describing how Christians read Scripture. And so when he talks about Christians, the New Testament writers, looking back over their texts and interpreting them in the light of the presence of Jesus or the Christ event, he calls that reading backwards an interpretive revolution. I would say, however, yes and no. Mark, I believe, is not giving an interpretive revolution in terms of how he composes his gospel. In terms of his compositional strategies and exegetical strategies, he's actually not doing anything new. He is inherited certain ways of interpretation of composing from Jewish scripture and tradition. The yes part in terms of the interpretive revolution is that he sees many of these theological aspects and scriptural aspects as fulfilled in the presence of and ministry of Jesus. So what I want to say is that that Mark is doing something not entirely unique with his compositional strategies. So what are the criteria for Mark to be within Judaism? That's the second question that we were given. And one key criterion would be then how Mark engages prior texts. All ancient literary cultures build on what came before, and we see this in Greco-Roman writers. They rework myths and histories to create cultural cohesion and moral reflection. Mark also does this, but he draws primarily on Jewish scriptures which carried theological authority and shaped Jewish communal identity. It's important then to think about how we identify scriptural reuse. And of course, the clearest marker is shared language. And this is something that the importance of shared language is something that that many scholars emphasize, even without introductory formula like it is written. There are verbal correspondences that help us to see not only citations but allusions. For instance, the use of Isaiah 6, 9, and 10 in Mark 4, 12 and 8, 18, where Mark is addressing spiritual blindness. Again, Richard Hayes has emphasized the importance of shared language in New Testament studies, and Jeffrey Leonard has emphasized the same thing in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible research. I think, though, that if we focus only or primarily or even mainly on shared language, we risk missing deeper connections. I think once we recognize that Mark has clear dependence on Isaiah through some explicit quotations and through some clear allusions, we can start identifying other kinds of scriptural reuse. And especially what I want to draw attention to is narrative patterning. So scriptural reuse can occur through motifs, rhythm, logic, or structure. And this structure would be what Robert Alter has called situation illusion, what Jeffrey Leonard has called narrative tracking, and what Michael Lyons has called narrative instantiation. And so in this case, news stories imitate the structure or flow of the earlier ones. It's not just the words, it's a sequence of ideas or events that signal scriptural engagement. So we might think of this, again, this is a practice or a compositional strategy we see in the Jewish scriptures. The Genesis flood narrative is echoed in the Sodom and Gomorrah account. We see the righteous versus the wicked, divine warning, destruction by rain or by fire, and the salvation of the remnant. We even see a little story where someone gets drunk and is taken advantage of their children. So it's the pattern, not just the phrases, that link these texts. Now, Leonard's key insight is that the new text should mirror the sequence of the source, but I think we need to go further, that parallels can be formal by mirroring events, and they can also be logical by preserving a cause and effect sequence. And so, again, with the Genesis flood narrative and Sodom and Gomorrah, it's not just the pattern of the narrative, but also the logical sequence that the wickedness, because of wickedness, therefore judgment. The other element that I think is important is that the parallels between the source text and the new text can appear at the level of story or discourse. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. Isaiah's servant songs offer a core pattern for not just for Mark, but even within the Jewish scriptures themselves and in other writings, writings in Jewish tradition. And there is a core pattern, a core story pattern, if you will, that a righteous servant suffers, is rejected, dies, and then is vindicated and exalted in view of God's universal reign. Isaiah also frames this with and this would be on the level of discourse. He has a proleptic exaltation in Isaiah 52:13 before describing the humiliation of the servant in Isaiah 53. This structure also has a logical component. Because the servant suffers righteously, he will be glorified. This logic shows up all over Jewish literature in the Second Temple period, starting with Isaiah itself in Isaiah 54 and 56 through the end of the book. In the third part of Isaiah, what is said about the servant is therefore the pattern for a ministry for servants, plural, who continue the servant's ministry after he's gone. We also see this in the Psalms, in Daniel, Zechariah, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Wisdom of Solomon, the second letter of Maccabees. All of these, we see in a widespread way, many texts picking up this language and motif of the servant to apply it to new situations. Paul's Christ hymn in Philippians 2 follows the same pattern, and I would argue so does Mark. Mark reworks Isaiah's storyline in multiple ways. And in this way, I guess I want to emphasize that Mark, in doing this, is doing what other people have already done. But he's doing it in his own way for his own context. He's taking up Isaiah's storyline, what Isaiah says about the servant. He reworks this by picking up Isaiah 5 and 6 to narrate the hard-heartedness of Israel. Also, divine intervention begins in Isaiah 40 and flows throughout the servant songs. Mark begins with a quotation there. Jesus's passion predictions summarize the servant's arc, suffering, death, and then exaltation. Like Isaiah, Mark places glorification before suffering. Think of the transfiguration in Mark 9 or the eschatological discourse in Mark 13. And Mark also reproduces Isaiah's logic. Because Jesus suffers righteously, he is therefore glorified. Mark then layers in other scriptures that have a similar sort of logic. Exodus, Daniel, Zechariah, all of these riff on or develop the servant theme. And this creates a coherent theological narrative that is grounded in Jewish tradition. So I know this is really fast. We don't have very much time, but what I want to suggest is that Mark's use of Isaiah is not just about quoting verses. It's about reworking Isaiah's structure and theology. And again, I'm focusing on Isaiah. Mark uses other texts too, but Mark reworks a story, an important story in Israel's history and tradition to tell the story of Jesus. It's not the same thing as Greco-Roman pastiche. It's a Jewish scriptural composition that Mark is doing here. If we see Mark in this way, this is the third question, what changes when we read Mark within Judaism? If we see Mark this way, we realize that it's not only the texts, but also the methods of composition that Mark uses that are Jewish. It also implies that Mark's author likely had a Jewish education, what Jason Zarowski calls Jewish paideia. This also shifts our interpretive lens. Mark isn't only a biography of Jesus, as Helen Bond has argued. It's also a communal story, a theological narrative embedded in Israel's history of exile, suffering, and hope. Reading Mark within Judaism in this way emphasizes the continuity by situating Jesus within a Jewish world wrestling with trauma, divine silence, and longing for restoration. Mark's gospel then, I believe, is a deeply Jewish text. It's rooted in Isaiah, among other scriptures, enriched by narrative patterns and animated by Jewish theology. It doesn't stand entirely apart from Judaism, but grows from it and within it. And I think by recognizing this, we don't just improve our understanding of Mark, we can open new conversations about how early Christians were reading their scriptures, forming their identity, and telling their stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Gospel of Mark as more rooted in the stories and the narratives and patterned after it. And then the follow-up question, which we want to address here, is when he's reworking it, how is he reworking it, and what is that doing for where Judaism is and where his group is on the margins, inside, outside. But we can discuss this more in a bit. That's our panelists for today. Thank you all very much. And just so everyone knows, a few of our participants need to come in and go out because of competing commitments, but they were gracious enough to also be able to join us. And so we may have to do a little bit of rearranging in our discussants section here. But our first contributor here is Neil Elliott with a small talk on the role of the crowds in Mark. So again, these are 5 minutes, and we're going to try to keep it to that. We're doing well so far. Neil, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And the crowds are a small part of this as it has developed. I have 5 broad points. The first, we should be explicit what we mean by Judaism. That question of definition keeps coming up. If we mean narrowly practicing the ancestral traditions that constituted membership in the Judean ethnos, like other ancient politeias, we would ask, does a text endorse or advocate such practices and such a politeia? If we mean more broadly, any interaction with the symbolic and cultural repertoire that Jews produced, then we simply ask, does a text engage passages or themes from the Septuagint, especially in its universalistic themes, as if that were enough? So to pick up a question Paula Fredriksen asked earlier, would Justin Martyr qualify as within Judaism in that broad sense, because he's interacting with Jewish symbols and honors Israel's God? The broader definition gives us a false positive. Different definitions mean looking for different evidence and reaching different conclusions. Second point, when we move from a figure we know, or at least many of us would believe was not Jewish, like Justin Martyr, to texts or figures who are anonymous or not explicitly identified, we need to distinguish a plausible argument from a probable argument. This is an argument that Shelley Matthews made several years ago in an Enoch seminar discussion of Luke Acts. Broad interaction with Jewish symbolism might make a text plausibly Jewish, but if that interaction resembles, she argued, 2nd century non-Jewish Christian figures and texts, we should judge a particular text more probably not within Judaism. What does this have to do with Mark? It isn't Luke Acts. Surely we know Mark was closer to Jesus and his Galilean context than to early 2nd century Gentile Christians. But my third point, that judgment may owe less to the narrative itself than to the unspoken assumptions that come along with Markan priority. If Mark was the earliest of the synoptics, we may assume it was not just chronologically closer to Jesus, but culturally and theologically closer as well. That leads us to discount or minimize distinctive Markan elements. The references to their synagogues, meaning Jewish synagogues, the reluctance to let the faithful refer to Jesus as Son of David, the absence of any endorsement of worship in the temple, the dismissive characterization, unique to Mark, of all the Jews as preoccupied with washing pots and pans, and the gloss that Jesus declared all foods clean, only in Mark 7. And the crowds, the now you see them, now you don't aspect of the Jewish crowds who follow Jesus as the son of David and then turn against him, not just the chief priests, but the crowds en masse. We don't have time here to discuss synoptic relationships with necessary depth. I just want to observe with Lamar Cope decades ago that the usual arguments for Mark and priority can be reversed. They go either way. One foundational bulwark is that we couldn't explain why a posterior Mark would have left out all the important material in Matthew and Luke. To the contrary, I would say one very clear explanation would be Mark leaves out material that doesn't matter for his story. He leaves out material that in Matthew and Luke serve to legitimize Jesus as Israel's Messiah, predicted by Israel's scripture. I would argue Mark does that because he doesn't care. A fourth point, Mark's narrative creates an implicit distance from Judaism. In addition to the features just listed, Breda identified as part of the messianic secret the disciples' incomprehension, their hardness of heart, which persists only in Mark to the end of the gospel. Note that Mark's Jesus tells his disciples they are those who are inside, to whom everything is revealed, yet they maintain hardness of heart. Mark's readers understand the disciples have a dual character. They are both the earliest recipients of full revelation of Jesus' identity, and they are members of an earlier generation, like the Jews around them, who failed to understand him fully. We see just this pattern in early Gentile Christian literature, in the Epistle to Barnabas, in Ephesians, in Justin's dialogue with Trypho. Revelation was given to the Jews, they didn't understand it. We Gentile Christians do. Finally, some of the routine explanations offered to keep the Gospels within Judaism play on stereotypes. Second Temple Judaism was a tumble of competing sects, all arguing against one another who was a real Jew. Anti-Jewish language in the Gospels is really just intra-Jewish bickering. That perpetuates a stereotype as Jews are being quarrelsome. It allows Christian readers to affirm our innocence, the innocence of our scriptures, and our innocence as descendants of the good Jews in those ancient arguments, so we can get on with our liturgies. Admittedly, in ancient sectarian disagreements, we do see Jews arguing, but we don't see them castigating other Jews for being Jewish or for wanting to practice the Torah. Those are marks of Gentile Christianity. They are things we should analyze historically, and I suggest theologically and morally we should reject. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think you illustrate how the questions we're trying to ask are so complicated, and there's so many different moving pieces and ways of explaining these things that, so thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Sarah Emanuel from Loyola Marymount University. So Sarah, you have the floor.
Sarah, we can't hear you.
Still not. We can go to the next discussant, if that's okay, Sarah. And then we can come back, unless it's working now. Is it working now?
Just switch to a laptop. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay, so sorry about that. Thank you for having me today. It is a pleasure to be here. My entryway into this conversation is a bit different from my fellow speakers, and I will be sharing more on this tomorrow in my talk on Revelation within Judaism, but for now, I will say that my general thoughts and questions revolve around the history of the within Judaism framework, where it comes from and why, and how that might shape our understanding of its usages across New Testament texts, including the Gospel of Mark. By way of background, the within Judaism framework stems from Pauline studies and implies the existence of other frameworks, the old perspective on Paul and the new perspective on Paul. These perspectives, of course, also have their own histories and nuances, but generally speaking, they tend to explore ideas of Jews and salvation. To put it briefly, the old perspective claims that Paul rejected Judaism in favor of a universal, non-Jewish Christianity. As such, Jews cannot be saved. The new perspective claims that Paul is against the ethnocentrism of Judaism. As such, Jews without serious reform, which is to say a ridding of Jewishness, cannot be saved. The radical new perspective, or what is now more commonly referred to as the Paul within Judaism approach, highlights that it's really Gentiles for Paul who need the most help. They are the ones who need Christ for salvation the most. Paul, moreover, according to proponents of this framework, was adamant that Gentiles stay Gentile. He even used harsh statements about the law in order to persuade Gentiles to stay as they are. There remain scholarly differences as to whether Paul sees Jews as also needing Christ for salvation, but the overarching point is that Paul is not once against Jews or Judaism. His theology, including his theology about Christ, comes from Judaism, and his harsh rhetoric does not discount that. Jews, like Gentiles, can stay as they are, in Christ debates notwithstanding. My point in naming all this again is to say that the within Judaism framework is one that implies the existence of other specific frameworks. Its primary, or at least initial function, is to offer counter-arguments to other approaches that have not only been legitimized by many scholars, but have also often teetered into the realm of anti-Semitism. Indeed, for many old and new perspectivers, Paul does not simply reject Judaism, but rightfully rejects it. This, all the more, makes the within Judaism approach a productive framework for countering previous ones. There are, of course, many other New Testament texts besides those we call Paul's that have been read as denouncing Jews and Judaism. The Gospel of John and the Book of Revelation have received ample attention in this regard. And yet, even within Johannine and Revelation studies, there do not exist categories of classification adhering to such views. In other words, there's no equivalent framework to the old perspective or the new perspective in Johannine or Revelation work, and thus perhaps no need for a within Judaism framework for pushback. It is my contention, in fact, that utilizing a within Judaism framework for these texts could, in fact, betray the framework's very pushback intentions by inadvertently creating avenues to solidify or legitimize the already lingering but not yet solidified by way of classification without Judaism perspectives in Johannine and Revelation work. In other words, if a within Judaism framework is not needed to discuss the work of John and Judaism or Revelation and Judaism, as Adele Reinhartz has shown, why use it at all? Especially if the framework can, in effect, bring about the solidification of without Judaism perspectives. Categories, in other words, tend to exist in relation to other categories. What kinds of categories will come into play if we bring this Pauline within Judaism framework elsewhere? And on top of all of this, is it possible to become so intellectually constricted by our focus on within Judaism that we miss when texts are anti-Jewish? Mark, though, at least in my studies and to the point of today's discussion, does not carry the same history of anti-Judaism as, say, Paul or John or Revelation. Sure, there are academic debates about the Mark and Jesus's discontents with other Jews, but it is not the same as having to wrestle with Paul-inspired replacement theology, or John's Jesus calling Jews children of the devil, or the many mistranslations about the synagogues of Satan in the book of Revelation. In other words, I don't necessarily see a within Judaism framework creating or legitimizing an equivalent old perspective or new perspective for studies in Mark and Judaism in the same way that I do for other New Testament texts and their relations to Judaism. And in that sense, while I still, alongside Reinhardt's, do not think the framework is needed to do the overarching work of situating Mark in a Jewish context, i.e., to study both the Jewishness of the New Testament and the relationship between Jews and the New Testament does not require this specific and what Reinhardt sees as a flattening conceptual structure, I am perhaps less concerned of it inadvertently legitimizing or sustaining anti-Jewish frameworks and Markan studies than I am in other areas of New Testament studies. Thus, to summarize, a within Judaism approach works well to counter alternative and already structured schools of thought in Pauline studies. I'm not sure it is needed elsewhere to do the kind of contextual work many of us are doing, but I am less concerned of its dangers in Markan scholarship than I am in other studies of New Testament texts, contexts, and interpretive histories. Thank you.
Thank you, and fascinating. Our next discussant is Juan Carlos Osando Widow from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome.
Hi to everybody. I am sharing a PDF. I really hope you can see it. How to read the narrator's aside of Mark 7:3-4 within Judaism. I quote the text. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, hoigar Pharisaioi kai pantes hoi Judaioi, do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining koshes. Most commentaries on Mark mention these two verses when discussing the intended audience of the author. In a recent one, Joy Williams, 2020, we read, "It is possible to gather some notable information about Mark's initial audience and its circumstances simply but from a close reading of Mark's Gospel itself. For example, Mark must have assumed that his audience included Greek-speaking Gentiles, that is, people who needed to have some Jewish traditions, groups, and terms explained. For example, 7:3-5, and Aramaic words and phrases translated. Many similar claims could be mentioned. I have chosen Williams because he does not stop there. He adds a consideration that is worth quoting because it's a signal of a change in the trend. He says, yet at the same time, Mark felt no need to give details about significant people or basic concepts from the Jewish scriptures. He could assume that most in his audience would know, for instance, who Isaiah or Elijah was, and what it meant to be a prophet sent from God, who David was, and what God had promised him concerning a coming kingdom, and who Moses was, and what it meant to live according to his commands. Williams is certainly right when he notes the absence of explanation similar to 7:3-4 in the rest of the Gospel. Furthermore, his remark can be extended to many other passages. For instance, recall the controversies with some Pharisees in chapter 2, which are very similar to 7:1-23. The readers do not receive any clarification about fasting or keeping the Shabbat. In light of this lack of comments about so many Jewish elements present in Mark, I want to propose that, when seen in the context of the whole Gospel, the narrator's aside in 7:3-4 should not be taken as an indication of a Gentile audience. If we suppose that the author had Gentile readers in mind when composing the text, we leave many other passages, or rather the whole Gospel, unexplained. However, if we suppose a Jewish audience of Mark, then our passage becomes problematic. What's the use of the explanation if the hearers were mostly Jews? How can a reference to what pantes hoi Judaioi do be relevant in such a communicative context? I limit myself to quote 3 solutions proposed recently to the problem without stopping to explain them because of time limitations. They can be taken as an answer to one of the questions proposed by the organizers of this meeting. What changes when the Gospel of Mark is read within Judaism? The first one comes from a performance critical analysis of the Markan audience. This is Thomas Boomersheim. The audience of Mark were predominantly addressed as Jews. When heard in that context, The aside to the audience explaining Jewish cleanliness is a gesture of inclusion of Gentile minorities in the projected audiences of the story. A second possibility consists of taking the aside as preparation for what follows, and now I quote Stephen Aherne-Kroll. The need to explain Jewish practices could be evidence for a Gentile audience for Mark, but it makes more sense to take these verses and this whole passage as preparing for the episodes that follow, where Jesus acts in stereotypically Gentile territory, performing 2 healings and another miraculous feeding. We have just heard something about this. And finally, John Van Maren, in an appendix to his last monograph, suggests that the reference to Pantes hoi Judaioi could be understood as indicating those who live in the Roman province of Judea, as different from a Galilean audience or simply from the average diaspora Jews. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this nice summary of this key verse. Our next contributor is Jakob Mortensen from Aarhus University in Denmark.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for inviting me. Just gonna share my screen. Can you see this, all of you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna start my watch, so I'm gonna keep the time. There. Okay, John asked me to speak a little bit about Mark being a possible Galilean scribe or priest. And this came from some of my studies with the education of Mark, how educated was Mark. So I have many points. I'm only gonna speak about those in bold, but I have approximately 6 or 7 slides. So his language, the geographical landscape obviously focuses on Galilee. His use of intertextuality, as Elizabeth has already touched on. His educational level, and possibly his genre, which Elizabeth and Helen also has touched upon. But other points could be added to. So when it comes to Mark's language and style, there are some usual suspects, especially if we take monograph size presentations of his style. Parataxis, duality, periphrasis, historical present, all these are known. There are some recent articles studying, for instance, parataxis and other focused studies as well. The ones on parataxis argue that Mark could possibly be translating from Hebrew because of his style and the way he uses parataxis. But when we take all of these together, his style and his language, I would say with Elizabeth that he's trained and he's trying to emulate Septuagint style or the scriptures of Israel. Alfredo Delgado Gomez has argued in 2 recent articles from 20 and 21 that if we look at Mark's vocabulary, his language, 96.5% is related to the Septuagint. If he knew both Greek and Hebrew, Joel Marcus, Kelly O'Brien, and Paul Sloan has argued that I think it's 3 places in Mark he's choosing the Hebrew version instead of the Greek Septuagintal version, so he might be bilingual and thus comes close to someone who's sitting at a table at a desk, figuring out which version of the scriptures of Israel he should use. So this is his language and style. Obviously, the geographical landscape plays a huge part. If he's a Galilean scribe or priest, Elizabeth Rose Melbourne has argued from the quote you can see here in Narrative Space, how important Galilee is. There are some obvious, the ocean of Galilee, the servant girl to Peter in the end, and the mentioning twice of I will go before you to Galilee. So that Mark should be a Galilean scribe or priest is actually just some mirror reading, or maybe just he was situated there, or Jesus was in Galilee, so that's why it's important. But I think it's it could be just very obvious. He's from there. That's why it's important. I'm not going to go into all of this about text reuse. I'm just going to focus on the top sentence. I see text use very much as an ethnocultural and literary formation in the classics. And he knew them. So he was well read in the scriptures of Israel. Elizabeth has gone through many of them. Ricky Watts counts, I think it's 86 quotations or allusions to the scriptures of Israel. So it's all through Mark. So he was obviously well read, well educated as well. I've been working on Mark's educational level, and I built on some classical scholars, Teresa Morgan, Raphael Carriero, Ruth Webb. But I've looked into the Progymnasmata, these introductory exercises to the tertiary stage of the ancient education. And I've found now 8 out of 10 exercises in Mark. In the 80s, it was very famous to do Kraya studies, but not many of the later of these exercises have been analyzed in Mark. But I think they're there. And as Elizabeth said earlier, he had a Greek education, but whether he should be read as more Greek or more Jewish is up for discussion. But my point would be that he was educated. So what about his genre? Most Markan scholars know that these are what is being discussed. Is it historiography, biography? There are 2 monographs arguing that Mark should be read as a tragedy, an ancient novel, or a gospel. But along with what Elizabeth said earlier, I would say that Mark doesn't fit into any of the classical Greek genres. He's imitating or emulating the scriptures of Israel about single persons in style and also very much in content. Yep. So this is my second last slide. Where may we plausibly locate a conglomeration of educational skills, literary prowess, ancestral understanding, and social position to match the above described features? And I think that's in a priest or a scribe. And I built on Samuel Adams, Christine Shams, and E.P. Sanders on this. Sanders states about the priests in Jerusalem, there was approximately 2,000 to 3,000. Sepphoris was the home of a high priestly family in Galilee. And he said, if aristocratic priests lived anywhere other than Jerusalem, Sepphoris is the most probable city. I'm not arguing that Mark was from a high priestly family in Sepphoris. I'm just saying that Sanders states that these people were in Galilee at this time. And my final slide, priests and Levites were forbidden to work the land, and they were on duty in the temple only 1 week in 24 plus the 3 pilgrimage festivals, a total of 5 or 6 weeks every year. So I just think it's plausible. Mark could plausibly have been a Galilean priest or scribe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next discussant is Laura Bizzarro from the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina. Laura, the floor is yours.
Yes, I need to share the PowerPoint.
It's coming. There we go.
I put here, one moment. Okay.
Great.
And this is my work. I want to read for you. Mm.
53 to 65. When we ask ourselves whether Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin should be read and interpreted within Judaism like any other text produced during the time of the Second Temple, we join the group of scholars who think that these writings were produced within this period. This new interpretation agrees with a growing number of scholars who propose that the New Testament should be examined and interpreted as Jewish texts as part of the rediscovery of the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. The arguments in favor of a comprehensive rereading of Mark within Judaism, for me, are A. The function of judging a defendant by the Sanhedrin, days before the Jewish Passover. While there are many doubts about when and at what time the trial occurred, Mark's intention is to introduce his readers to the rejection Jesus experienced by the leading Jewish dignitaries. In first-century Roman Judea, all messianic attempts were rejected by the Sanhedrin, and the alleged messiahs condemned to death. B. The false testimony presented by the witnesses who accused Jesus of wanting to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. The witnesses present their false testimony, Mark 14, verse 58, as an attack on the main political religious institution, charged with ensuring compliance with the law of Moses. This testimony that Mark speaks of would fall within the shared historical memories that involve the events depicted in Mark's narrative that begin with John the Baptist, include the proclamation of the good news and the accounts in parables, and culminate with the accounts of his death and resurrection. To understand how Mark's Judaism is nurtured, we must keep in mind that the memoirs feature prominently in the narrative framework of the gospel. All shared historical memories come from a common literary heritage shared by first-century Jews. All of the historical figures are heroes of the Israelite past shared and known to the audience of the Gospel of Mark. All quotations from texts pertain to the Hebrew Bible, mainly references to the law of Moses, and repeated allusions and references are made to events and texts from these historical memories, e.g., to Exodus, the law of Moses, Daniel 7, and the Passover. The messianic idea represented by the syntagm of the Son of Man coming from the clouds of heaven. C. The trial of Jesus by the Sanhedrin, if we take into account that Mark was probably written in Rome before or during the destruction of the Second Temple by the Roman legions of Titus, 70 AD. Importantly, their destruction was foretold in Mark 13 verses 1-2, 1458, as a prophetic eschatological announcement. Mark could not have been sure that the Romans would destroy the temple before its destruction occurred. He would not have taken the risk of including the prophecy of 13:2 if it had not already been fulfilled. D. The reference to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem and its death sentence allows us to establish that Mark 14 verses 54-64 must be read within Judaism. The Sanhedrin is mentioned and its members are also listed, Caiaphas as high priest, charged with pronouncing the sentence, and the other priests, scribes, and presbyters who ratify the sentence for the crime of blasphemy. MK 14-15 presents a narrative plot where the chief priests were the ones who carried Jesus to the cross, making use of the power of the Roman prefect. Yarbrough Collins comments that, historically speaking, it is unlikely that the Sanhedrin would have held a formal trial of Jesus if his death was the objective, for only the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate had the right to concur in capital punishment cases. The evangelist implicates the Jewish leaders in Jesus' death because he wants to argue that the reasons for his death were strictly religious and not political, in the strict sense. E. The alleged blasphemy of Jesus, the affirmative answer given by Jesus to the high priest Caiaphas when the latter asks him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jews respond, "I am." Although Caiaphas does not pronounce the name of Yahweh, but substitutes it for blessed, because for Second Temple Judaism, yes, constituted the grave crime of blasphemy. Jesus proclaimed himself to be the Messiah, the Son of Man, equal to God. Really, what did this imply? The ego eimi of Jesus was equivalent to his messianic self-proclamation before the Sanhedrin, plus a statement that appealed to the phrase Son of Man in Daniel 7. It constituted the serious crime of blasphemy because it was defined as equal to God. Within the Jewish tradition, the name of Yahweh could not be pronounced due to the respect and reverence that was held for the sacred name of God. Jesus answered in the affirmative the high priest's question, which involved revealing his messiahship, even though he had commanded the disciples to be kept secret. Mark 8, verses 27 to 31. Conclusion. The judgment of Jesus within Judaism from the analysis of the evidence we find in Mark 14, verses 53 to 65, we can establish that the judgment by the Sanhedrin was within the limits of Judaism. We join the work that the Enoch Seminar has been developing to establish a comprehensive rereading of this gospel within the Jewish texts produced during the time of the Second Temple. The most significant findings that allow us to affirm its rereading within Judaism are: A, the Sanhedrin's function of judging a defendant. B, the false testimony presented by the witnesses. C, Jesus' response to the high priest and his death sentence for the crime of blasphemy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that nice treatment of the Sanhedrin scene. Our next presenter is Paul Wheatley, assistant professor of New Testament at the Nashotah House in Wisconsin. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen also. Let's see here. And there. Are we there? Let's see. I need to switch which screen is being shared.
You should be able, when you click share, to click which screen you want.
There we go. Okay.
We are seeing your presenter notes. Just so
okay. Has that swapped? Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you. Thinking about writing within Judaism, Mark 7 presents a window into Jesus's halakhic context, how the evangelist frames and shapes Jesus' tradition, and where that fits into the writer's textual engagement with Judaism. Mark 7:1-23 presents two discourses framed by a narrative introduction. The first discourse in Mark 7:5-13 presents Jesus' discussion with Pharisees over his disciples' neglect of, quote, the tradition of the elders to eat bread with defiled or common hands, kinas hersin. In this discourse, Jesus pivots from discussion about hand cleanliness to interpret Isaiah 29:13 with respect to accusation of the Pharisees abandoning the commandment of God, holding to the tradition of humans, extended in the discussion of Korban in Mark 7:9-13. The second discourse in Mark 7:14-23 begins with an address to the crowd about inner or outer trajectories of impurity, and continues in 17-21 with an explanation of the inner and outer purity with the disciples. Much attention has been devoted to the evangelist's narrative aside in Mark 7:19, katharizon panta tavromata, cleansing all the foods. I'm convinced by John Van Maren, Logan Williams, and others that this does not refer to an abrogation of kashrut regulations, but I think the key to understanding to what Mark refers and his location vis-a-vis Judaism is the discussion of baptisms in the narrative introduction of Mark 7:1-4. Specifically, in Mark 7:4, the writer describes how coming from marketplaces, if they have not baptized, ean min baptizonte, aorist middle subjunctive, perhaps better translated if they have not baptized themselves, they do not eat, followed by a list of further baptisms they observe, baptisms of cups and pots and copper vessels and beds. Jesus' discourse with the Pharisees in Mark 7:5-13 is ultimately about the source of defilement from outside or inside. As a halakhic discussion, he appeals to the logic of the Levitical purity system, and he leverages this logic against the Pharisees' observance of unprescribed hand-washing rites as an unnecessary accretion that functions contrarily to the Levitical system. It's easy to read this discourse within the Judaism of Jesus' day as a halakhic discussion between two disputing factions of Judaism in which Jesus refers to their shared authoritative text, the Torah. In asking about the Markan evangelist's location within Judaism, however, the second discourse indicates a group of Jesus' disciples that could reflect the situation of Mark's earliest audience. I realize I'm rehashing form criticism here a little bit, showing concern about the sources of impurity and purification. Jesus' address focuses attention on the internal origin of ritual impurity, bodily emissions, scale disease, death in Leviticus, but read as an analogy to moral impurity arising from within as well. The concern is not so different from what we see in the Qumran community rule that deals with moral offense at the moral and ritual level, requiring repentance and washing. Jesus does not directly prescribe a washing like the Qumran community, but evinces a similar analogy between ritual and moral purification, as we see also in Psalm 51:4 in the Hebrew, 2 in English. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin. Mark's framing, however, in Mark 7:1-4, raises the issue of baptisms. Specifically, the Pharisees and all the Jews repeated self-baptisms and baptisms of various vessels, a consideration absent from Jesus' original discourse. I suggest that Mark frames this discussion about washings to contrast the repeated external washings of the Jews, or the Judaioi, with the baptism with the Holy Spirit Jesus is said to bring in Mark 1:8. And then Jesus' actions throughout Mark 1-6, and especially in Mark 5, seems to drive out internal sources of impurity from the demoniac in Mark 5:1-21, the Zavah in Mark 5:25-34, and Jairus' dead daughter in Mark 5:35-43. Jesus' baptism, Mark's framing implies, brings the internal cleansing power of the Holy Spirit to drive sources of impurity from within, solving the problem Jesus raises in the second discourse. This picture then suggests that this suggests of Mark's Judaism is complex. It introduces a rite ostensibly derived from Torah-prescribed ritual washings, reinterpreted as conveying God's divine power through the Spirit to cleanse internally and, one might assume, externally. Insofar as it involves ritual purification through washing, it works with regulations established in the Torah, treats those prescribed washings as effective and necessary, and it portrays Jesus as appealing to the Torah and prophets as authoritative. Yet by positing an interpretation of this rite that could be seen as obviating the Torah's ritual purity system, kind of once-for-all washing versus a repeated system of washings, it may indicate a break between Mark's audience and the Pharisees Jesus addressed. The addition of all the Jews or all the Judeans in 7:3 suggests a further differentiation between Mark's audience and Jews. In the chat yesterday, John Van Maren spoke of such breaks creating a liminal zone of redefinition without a clear or pre-existing category, not yet Christianity, but sort of organized around Christ adherence. However, insofar as this halakhic discussion and the categories of ritual and moral rectitude are the substance of the discussion Mark deploys to that end and are framed in terms of purity, whatever community self-definition exists, the Torah, the prophets, and categories of ritual and moral purity established from those texts, and Jesus' interpretation of them, suggests that Mark views his community in dialogue with other Jewish groups over texts they hold to be authoritative. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Very interesting. We have two more. Our next presenter is Margaret Froelich, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Claremont School of Theology in Los Angeles. Margaret.
Thank you. Near the end of yesterday's very rich and inspiring discussion of the phrase within Judaism, somebody, and please forgive me, I didn't note down your name, brought up the difference between Judaism as a set of religio-cultic commitments and as a socio-political identity with reference to the Roman Empire. That distinction's important. Even if hypothetically a person could argue that Paul has left cultic and theological Judaism by the time of his surviving writings, we can't argue that he stopped being Judean, whatever that means for him in a diasporic context. I believe that in Mark, the matter of political identity is paramount. I agree with Helen and many others that it is a post-70 composition. And so unlike my colleagues today, I'm not setting out to demonstrate or refute Mark's location within Judaism. Rather, I'm assuming that Mark, whatever its cultic and other relations to Judaism, is certainly Judean. Not a distinction in Greek, but I think an occasionally useful one in English. And a part and product of its historical political milieu. This is too short of a format to go into the details of post-colonial theory, mimicry, and assimilation, but suffice to say that any imitation of Rome in Mark is, in my view, a Judean one, and therefore fodder for our continuing investigation into the nature and diversity of Judaism in the ancient world. Therefore, my question is not what changes when we read Mark within Judaism, but what changes when we read Mark as a Judean interaction with Rome.
My demonstration of the Gospel of Mark's imitation with the Roman Empire started as an investigation of Markan kingship and divinity. That became a dissatisfaction with the way that the most prominent voices in empire criticism at that time were reading a Western progressive version of Marxism into the text, with some going so far as to declare that Mark and Jesus were intentionally attempting to create a new, radically egalitarian, anti-violent, and most importantly, real communal society. What I found is that the first step of understanding kingship and divinity in Mark is understanding that Mark is not, at the most basic level, proposing any new political or social framework. You don't need me to detail the whole schema. You know that Jesus is the ruler in Mark, second to God. You know that Satan is the enemy, often, if not exclusively, discussed in military terms. These are 3 points of a pretty traditional political structure, eminently recognizable in the context of a post-Alexandrian politics: sovereign, delegate, military threat, framed within a Jewish mythological world. Post-colonial thinkers like Benny Liu have shown that proposals of flat hierarchies below Jesus in the kingdom don't hold up to the text. There are people who do better and worse, who are more and less worthy of Jesus's trust, and more and less elite. Certainly the 12 enjoy elite status that even other close disciples, in particular the female ones, do not. But even their status is contingent on their effectiveness and their loyalty. Not for nothing do the 12 disappear at the end of the text after they've fled from Jesus' side at his worst moment. One of the ways that many interpreters have been able to claim that Mark is declaring a kingdom of peace in the face of a supposedly uniquely violent, uniquely oppressive Rome is by relegating most of the violence in the text, and there's a lot, to the spiritual realm. Jesus' combat against unclean spirits doesn't count as combat, not because it isn't violent, the spirits certainly perceive it to be so, but because the enemy combatants are imagined in such a way that violence against them can be dismissed as not real. This is not to bring into question the justice of Jesus' actions in his exorcisms or the occasional necessity of violent revolution in general. Simply a reminder that framing violent revolution as non-violent entirely because of who the violence was acted upon is not historically a promising way to begin a new political system. Beyond the ethics of interpretation, though, I take you back to exegesis and comparative literature. Nowhere in Mark is the conflict happening in the spiritual realm. It's happening live, right in front of people, to people, with real and lasting effects on their lives. The future disasters of chapter 13 don't happen in the spiritual realm any more than the Temple Act does in chapter 11. Further, other texts dealing with wartime gods, Jewish, Roman, and Greek, don't limit divine action to a separate plane of existence either. Even when the gods and angels fight only each other in their battles, their battles affect humans through weather and other phenomena. But most of the time in such texts, gods don't only fight each other. Apollo and Pan took the field at Delphi against the Gauls, not against the Gauls' gods. Michael and Gabriel fought Persia, not Persia's gods. In summary, the kingdom of God in the Gospel of Mark is an expression of Judean sovereignty that echoes the Roman Empire in most of the same ways that it echoes all of the other relevant historical empires. Sovereigns delegate client kings and generals. Delegates fight and defend against expansionist wars. The elite command authority. Detractors are punished. And violence, in the words of the inimitable Eric Idle, is inherent in the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one last discussant. And I know that Nathaniel had to jump in and out, and I think I just saw you come back, Nathaniel. If that's true, go ahead and take over. If you're not yet there, then I will just wait in silence for 1 minute as you do nothing. Okay, it's completely possible Nathaniel has stepped away because of other commitments, which we knew about beforehand. I think the best way to do this then is for us to take a short break for our just to refresh, and then we'll come back for discussion. And whenever Nathaniel arrives, we'll pause and he'll give his contribution. I think that works pretty well. So it is, according to my clock, 36. I know the hour is different for many of us. He's here. Let's switch gears. Nathaniel, are you ready to present?
I am, yes.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. I'm just going to speak about a single verse in Mark today. I'll read it out for you. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Either Mark was unfamiliar with the geography of Palestine, or he simply did not care much if his geography was accurate or not. So says Paul Actomai of Mark 7:31. A.W.F. Blunt is, unsurprisingly, blunt. The geography is impossible. Cranfield is a bit kinder. It reflects a certain vagueness on Mark's part about the geography of northern Palestine. But Carl Ludwig Schmidt speaks for most when he says that Mark expresses himself clumsily due to his ignorance of the geographical conditions. The journey is like going from New York to Washington by way of Boston down the Mohawk Valley, says Edward Schweitzer. Joel Marcus, a proper transatlantic scholar, can't help but offer two analogies. Mark's notice is comparable to a description of an American trip from Portland to Denver via Seattle and the Great Plains, or a British trip from Liverpool to London via Glasgow and Norfolk. Now, let's be honest, these are not very good analogies. Sidon is approximately 25 miles north of Tyre. Damascus, the northernmost city of the Decapolis, is roughly 90 miles east of Sidon, across the mountain road. And our final destination, Lake Tiberias, is about 65 miles south of Damascus, the journey ending roughly 55 miles southeast from where it started. So I'm very pleased to announce to the Enoch seminar today the official analogy for Jesus' tour in Mark 7:31. It is actually like going on a rather depressing tour of the British Midlands, starting in Birmingham, going all the way to Northampton via Wolverhampton and Peterborough. There it is. Geographical oddities aside, commentators can agree on one thing about Mark 7:31. Jesus' travels in these districts prefigure for Mark the Gentile mission of the church after Jesus, says Hurtado. It prefigures or perhaps even inaugurates the mission to the Gentiles, says Yarbrough Collins. Maloney is even more direct. Jesus turns away from Israel and works miracles for Gentiles in Gentile lands. But was this how a first century Judean would have understood it? Tyre, Sidon, and the Decapolis had more in common than being so-called Gentile lands. To the contrary, these city-states were all included in the most generous definitions of the land of Israel. While no two maps are the same, from Joshua to the rabbis, the northern boundaries of the land are said to be Sidon in the northwest, and the region of Hamath and Damascus in the northeast, while the region that would become the Decapolis marks its eastern boundary. Judahite and Hasmonean kings and queens tried unsuccessfully to bring it under Judean control until it was officially annexed by Rome following Pompey's conquest of Syria. It was here that the first revolt broke out as Jews and Gentiles vied for control of these cities. And even after the total Roman conquest of Syria-Palestine, the rabbis insist that the southern Syria belonged to Ha-Eretz Yisrael, and that in the days of the Messiah, the gates of Jerusalem will extend as far as Damascus. So what exactly is Mark's Jesus doing, rambling through these regions? This is not, I argue, a mission to the Gentiles. Rather, Jesus' circuitous route bears all the marks of a ritual perambulation, laying claim to a territory. The Babylonians and Assyrians established borders and purified the land by ritually walking its boundaries. The Romans likewise performed ritual perambulation in the festivals of Ambivalia, Terminalia, Pomerium, and the rites of Lustratio and Suovaterilia. The ancient Judahites inherited from Babylon the concept of conquest and land acquisition through ritual perambulation, while the rabbinic principle of chazakah, acquiring property by walking its length and breadth, based on Genesis 13, is indebted to rituals of Roman land surveying. Communities today still ritually walk boundaries to purify land and reassert territorial claims. In England, parish boundaries are consecrated by forming the beating of the bounds, which used to involve whipping young boys to remind them of the boundary markers, sadly no more. While in the Scottish borders, this is known as common riding and is done on horseback. The regions visited by Mark's Jesus, the country of the Gerasenes, Tyre, Sidon, the region of the Decapolis, were precisely those annexed or made autonomous by Rome after the Pompeian settlement of 63 BCE. Rome's grip on the region only tightened after 70. Having a Jewish Messiah perambulate the boundaries of this territory while purifying it would have struck Judeans and Romans as a provocative act of reclamation. Restoring these lands to Israel was a policy for the Hasmoneans, as well as the Judean revolutionaries, while some believed it would happen in the Messianic age. So if we are to take Mark's Judaism seriously, we must reckon with the high probability that the gospel has its own territorial ideology. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that rich presentation and for all of them. It's been really stimulating, a lot of ideas, a lot of things to discuss, I think. Let's take 5 minutes. So it's 42 right now. Let's come back at 47 or 48, and then we will open a discussion among the participants. All right. All right. According to my clock, it's been 5 minutes. I hope you are fully refreshed. I'm doing my best. We've discussed a lot, and there's a lot of ideas out there. And so maybe we can do a little bit of grouping or sort of organizing before we get started. There's a discussion of specific texts. I think Mark 7 has popped up quite a bit, and others too. Stuff in the crucifixion scene was touched on by different presentations. Also specific texts by individuals we can talk about there. There's also, of course, the question of definitions and boundaries, which we talked about a lot last time. For example, I think Heidrun made the good point that even a gospel open to the nations in a very expansive way, Mark is often understood, works with as a Jewish text still, but not maybe a complete shift away from the Jews in some way, at least on my definition. A couple of people also touched on questions of contemporary motives and implications. I'm thinking especially of Sarah's contribution and Margaret's, and I touched a bit on it briefly in my introduction as well. Social setting, location of the text, Rome, Palestine, who the author is, their profile, and then also questions of how the text created meaning, how the text would have created meaning in antiquity, how the writer might have intended that to be, how symbolic is it, how literal, how spiritualized are things like the kingdom of God, for example. And so anyway, these are just a variety of types of questions we can have. Before we get started, a couple people need to have already left and will be leaving early just because of competing schedules. So Elizabeth Shively had to leave. She had a very busy time, and so it was really nice that she could join. And I think a couple others will leave a little bit early, but it's great for whoever is able to be part of the next hour plus. I don't have a particular structure for this. I just leave it to the panelists and the discussants to jump in with whatever is most interesting, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, so the floor is open for the panelists, and of course, everybody in the audience can also comment in the chat, and I will read as much as I can and try to work with those too. So okay, it's open. Whatever is on your mind. Gabriella has a hand up, so that's a great place to start.
John, just to start reading from the chat, I mean, some questions came about who the Judaioi are in the Gospel of Mark. Of course, this was a consequence of many. If Judaismos in Mark is the way of life of all the members of the people of Israel, or is the way of life of a certain group? No, these questions, of course, are also for Paul or John or other authors. And then about the audience, because from some were implying a Gentile audience, some were implying a mixed audience of Gentiles. Of course, I think we are all talking of God-fearers, because I mean, we are. I mean, I don't think that they are talking directly to people that have no knowledge of Jewish monotheism or the God of Israel. I mean, they do not need to be educated, instructed about the belief in one God. I mean, in order to understand the questions in the Gospel of Mark, of the audience should have had a certain knowledge of Jewish scripture or of Jewish monotheism, etc. But it remains, if Mark is addressing in particular, as somebody has said, God-fearers, non-circumcised people or Jews of a diaspora. So I think these are some of the basic questions that has been also raised by people in the chat.
Paul.
Yes, thank you for that, Gabriella. And just to kind of kick off with the question you asked, I think specifically, I'm fairly intrigued, not just because it's helpful to my own reading of Mark 7 within Judaism, but of John's reading of this as the Judeans, and combining this with Jacob's observation that Mark might be a Galilean scribe and possibly priest. This you could read this just as much as an explanation to Galilean Jews of Judean practices, and I think that that aids the explanation of this text within Judaism. The point that I want to add, if we kind of accept that reading as possible, really what we have in this case could be an explanation of washing practices for Galilean Jews who are in the process of accepting Gentiles perhaps into their context, but that are thinking about on what basis or how are people acceptable at specifically at a meal, because the concern is about eating artos, bread, and so possibly the introduction into the communal meal of those who for some reason or another have or have not been washed, and explaining, both situating Jesus's discussion with the Pharisees, and then also with that addition of and all the Judaioi, specifically to situate this into a broader context of different washing practices and discussions within Judaism about this and where that fits into Christian participation.
I see in the chat Isaac mentions Jonathan Adler's work on the origins of Judaism, basically saying that the archaeological data on purity, I think, doesn't make a distinction between Galilee and Judea. That doesn't mean there aren't differences, but what's materially visible, I think it's hard to demonstrate that, at least. If I'm understanding him right. There's a couple more hands. I think they show up on my screen in order, so I'm going to go in that order. Sarah?
Sorry, there we go. One of the things that I sort of heard in Gabriella's comments was sort of getting at this potential tension of thinking that, okay, many implied audience members are either Jewish or perhaps God-fearing Gentiles, those in the know, paired with then why are things sometimes explained if people are in the know, so to speak. And I was thinking about this throughout the talks. And I think it's important to just really start with the premise of not just a difference in debate within Judaism, but just profound multiplicity. We're not talking about a monolithic people, just as Jews aren't, we're not a monolith today. They certainly weren't in antiquity either. And it's quite possible that even if one is Jewish, or even if one was a Jewish Christ follower, that what they've read might not be the same, or what they've heard might not be the same as other Jews around them. Just because someone's Jewish doesn't mean that they're automatically thinking about messianism, for example. We can't assume, oh, Jew means that they think and know X, Y, and Z. So explaining something, I don't think, negates Jewishness whatsoever, or being in the know or being part of a community whatsoever.
Hydron?
Okay, thank you. That would in part also answer my question maybe already. But my question would be if it were only Jewish listeners, which I'm completely not convinced of, then why would he need to explain koinos, koinun? Because Greek people would understand that only as common. They wouldn't even hear something with purification in that term. While I would assume that within Judaism, people know that term very well, also from the controversy with with the whole purification debate with Gentiles, also with suppressionist indication there. And but Sarah, do I understand you in this way correctly, that you would say, well, maybe some Jews would have also not known, so that's why Mark needs to explain that?
Potentially, but I'm not making the argument that this is surely only a Jewish audience. I'm open to Gentile audiences as well, but that the very explaining of something doesn't negate the possibility that, yeah, maybe some Jews wanted some kind, or perhaps needed some kind of explanation of another Jew's understanding of something.
Okay, yeah, at least that would be a broad framing for an answer to that question. But on a more specific level, there are maybe more answers to that. But that's a serious question of mine, yeah, for Mark 7. And of course, also with my reading the Syrophoenician woman and the way I just did, I would also assume that Mark 7 already prepares for opening the table for the Syrophoenician, and later on, like the table for Gentiles, which Mark 7 would indicate for me with the Syrophoenician, and then also Mark 8 with the feeding of the 4,000. And so that would all be a very nice order to prepare it in Mark 7 and so on. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say for now.
Isaac.
Yeah, just in response to the very important question that Heidrun raises. I mean, first, Jonathan Adler, I think, is making a claim, a pretty persuasive claim, that the material evidence points to widespread observance of ritual purity practices in the land of Israel. So that suddenly this parenthetical explanation at the beginning of Mark might actually be rather accurate if we're thinking of Judeo as Judeans and not so much Jews in the diaspora. But there was widespread, indeed, all the Jews or most of the Judeo did indeed wash their hands and their pots and what have you to eat. So I'm just putting that out. I'm not sure that Mark is explaining the meaning of the word koinos or koineo in 719 B or C at the very end. If we no longer take that as a parenthetical statement following Logan Williams, but a continuation of what Jesus is saying in the preceding verses, so that actually what Jesus is explaining in Mark is not the meaning of that verb, but the meaning of what happens to food, right, that is ingested, food that may have been ritually defiled. How that connects then with the rest of the pericope or the units that follows is a good question to think about, but just wanted to point those 2 points out. Which then, third and last point, with what was brought up by Juan Carlos, it's really an interesting point. Why is it that only here in Mark 7, the author feels a need to explain Jewish praxis or Jewish elements, but not elsewhere? I'm leaning right now, just as I speak, that Judeo in this case might well refer to the Judeo in the Holy Land. And therefore, for a diaspora audience, whether Jewish or not, you could use items. Because diaspora, I mean, the diaspora evidence, somebody asked that question. I don't think the evidence for the diaspora is clear and cut. We don't have clear evidence as much to demonstrate that diasporan Jews were practicing these ritual purity laws to the extent that they were done in Judea. So therefore, this explains perhaps why the author explains only this item of Jewish practice and not other items such as Sabbath keeping, which diasporan Jews do keep.
Paul.
Yes, thank you. And Isaac, I really appreciate that nuance that you offer too on the possibility that Judaioi could be referring to Holy Land Jews vis-a-vis diaspora Jews. I think one way or the other, what this gives us is a way of seeing this as a conversation that need not be explaining only to Gentiles what's going on. But I think to Hadrian's question about koinos, I think specifically he's not really explaining so much the categories of koinos or its opposite as much as I think it frames that being unwashed makes one koinos in this particular case, which I think just in framing the conversation about washings does strike me as intriguing. It's also intriguing on just the narrative points that that you outline, specifically that by outlining who gets to eat the bread or who doesn't, and then that you have this sort of transitional portion in 7:1-23 that then kind of moves forward to the Syrophoenician woman, the feeding of the 4,000, which I think, I wasn't able to say this in my talk, but I think those feedings are also preceded by a sea crossing that Jesus does with the Sea of Galilee, which I think is representative of baptismal washing in Mark's gospel. There's a much longer argument that goes into that, but I find this this is a challenge that that in November Jacob and John presented to me as I presented another form of this argument that I talked about today. Just if this is referring to baptism and specifically the Holy Spirit, in what way does this remain within Judaism? I tried to highlight some ways that it does, but to Hadrian's point, I mean, it does in some ways point to Gentile inclusion on a certain set of terms if we think about this as a reference to baptism. And so at a certain point, there's that sort of liminal space that John talked about yesterday that we have to think about here. And I think you're really right to point that out, Hadrian. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
I wonder if we could take that story and the way it's connected in this almost like perfect sort of mechanism of story purportedly setting aside, major markers of Jewish identity, then a travel outside the land, meets this person who's explicitly Greek and Syrophoenician, that is not Jewish, and then has a reversal, and then goes from the feeding on the west side to the feeding on the east side, and after this travel through Galilee, as this, it's such a perfectly nicely packaged version of this transition to a mission to the Gentiles, it seems. And I argue against this in my book, but I'm putting it in a conversation right now with Nathaniel's presentation, right? And I really like the language, ritual perambulation, laying claims to the land. And I think I lost the last little bit. But the idea that I argue something similar in my project, where these trips outside the land, or the areas that are demographically majority Jewish versus the ones where there are only Jewish minority communities, is part of an exploration of an expanded land, and that the persons they meet there are, or that Jesus goes there and targets there, are specifically Israel called back. And so I just wonder what the thoughts are on that, and specifically the role of the Syrophoenician woman there. And because on the one hand, it's so neatly packaged and it works so well, but I think there's a few narrative problems in there, which I don't want to jump in right now, but I see Nathaniel has a hand up, so I'd love to go to Nathaniel.
Well, this is just to second that point, and to bring it back to Hadrian's comments about the two feeding miracles, one with 12 baskets left over, one with 7. I would have a different way of explaining the 7. We can all agree that numerically they're significant, but I would not so much see it as a universal outreach to Gentiles, but rather referring specifically to the 7 nations of the land of Israel, that this still very much has this territorial dimension to it. All of these ancient maps that, include these borders that we've been talking about, still acknowledge that there are other peoples in the land. And this is Mark acknowledging that and incorporating them into this restored messianic kingdom. And in that sense, very similar to the Hasmoneans, who are doing the exact same thing in their political program. So I would look at it slightly different.
Hadrian.
And then have to ask the question about that the gospel will go into the whole world. how you interpret that. I know that John has a certain interpretation to that. I would stay with also with the translation that it really means the whole world and not the diaspora Judaism. So if we have that as a frame, I think it makes a lot of sense to interpret the 4,000 in a universalistic way. Also still making the argument strong that universalism is very well established within Judaism. Yeah, so I think we don't need to make so much strain to actually not see it in Mark. So my question is, what about those statements in Mark 13 and 14 that the gospel reaches out into the whole world? And then also my question, if you don't see the feeding of the 4,000 universalistic, why then is the Syrophoenician woman explicitly a Greek woman actually situated before that story? I mean, it makes so much sense to put it all in this order, to read it in that order. That would also be my question there. But first, I mean, is the gospel directed to the whole world or not?
I think it might be interesting to compare it to Matthew on this particular point, because I think Matthew understands Mark quite well on this. You have this emphasis on targeting Israel, people of the land. You have the interesting change of the Syrophoenician woman to the Canaanite woman, and if we've got time, we can discuss that later. But then the gospel still ends with this sort of universal mission, go and make disciples of all nations. So I see this, they're not in contradiction to one another. You can have this restoration of the land of Israel and the nations within it as well, and this sort of mission beyond the land of Israel, as it were. And I mean, you very much see this in Luke as well, and Luke Acts very much taking this program further beyond the land of Israel. So I don't see them necessarily at odds with each other. But why have the Syrophoenician woman first? I think kind of, as you said, it lays out the paradigm, which is, the dogs can eat the crumbs under the table. They are able to eat, but they eat second. And you have the second feeding miracle. It corresponds very nicely with the message of the Syrophoenician woman. So I think we'd agree on that.
Maybe if I can jump in real quick, just because I have arguments on both of these questions. On the Syrophoenician woman, I wonder if it's just if the function of the story is mostly just to add one more layer to the sort of ballooning popularity of Jesus, even the nations, right? He goes there. He doesn't want to be seen, but even a Greek Syrophoenician woman comes and asks for healing. He says no, and then she answers Jesus responds not because she's persistent or because she's witty, but because she actually answers the substance of his complaint. Like Jesus says, I can't take the food from the children and give it to the dogs. But she says, we're only eating the crumbs. And so it's not a risk to the children, but it's just crumbs. And then there's no resolution. She's not called to follow him. There's no even nice exchanges made, like in other healing stories where the person leaves. And so it's really abrupt, and it's that would be my take on that. Real quickly, and then I'll get to Sarah's hand. And Heidrun and I have talked about this, and I've done some work on it, but not enough yet since we've talked about this. The Mark 13:10 verse, that the good news might be proclaimed among all the nations. It's the preposition eis panta to ethne, which, at least for today, I'm going to limit it here. It can be understood spatially, okay? And I argue, echoes Isaianic text. So it's among the nations. It doesn't designate the nations as explicitly the target audience. And in the Septuagint, we see the same phrase and preposition constantly used to refer to the diaspora. But more specifically, in 4 instances, or the Jews sent into the diaspora because of conquest and punishment. But in 4 instances in Isaiah, the same phrase is used to refer to something like this herald or something going into the nations to call Israel back. So I'm interested in the idea that they're going into the nations, but they're really gathering Israel back. Just my thing. Let me go to Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess I want to respond to this in a couple of ways. First and foremost, I see the idea that nations are included in this story and in this idea of a future eschaton or an imminent eschaton as still very much part of many Jewish messianic views and messianic hopes. The idea that one day the God of Israel will be seen by all as the God of all people. All people includes Jews and non-Jews. But in response to that, I have two thoughts, really, yeah, two thoughts. One is more of a concern. I worry that within Judaism framework constricts us a little bit. So for example, we could argue, as I just did, that sure, reaching out to non-Jews, reaching out to the nations is still within Judaism. It's still part of a Jewish theological common messianic premise, and yet terminology of liminality has already been raised because we're also talking about non-Jews. And so I worry that we might be feeling stifled by this within Judaism framework of trying, like, is it liminal or is it solely within Judaism? Why do we need this category to do this kind of study and have this kind of conversation? And then the second response I have to that is that I still do, though, see the inclusion of non-Jews into this theological understanding. I don't see it as universal. I don't see it as a universal theological premise. I see it as quite particular because it is still bringing in folks into a Jewish Christ and the Jewish God, the God of Israel. So it's still a particular kind of framework. It's casting aside certain ideas in favor of a particular idea.
Gabriela?
No, I agree with Sarah that the inclusion of Gentiles is still something that could be defined within Judaism, because even Hellenistic Jews were including Gentiles. So it's not that the Christians are the first one to include Gentiles in their communities. So this should not be an element of discrimination, not to say, okay, Mark is within Judaism, depending on the fact that he's included or not Gentiles. I mean, of course, there is the idea of the eschatological inclusion of Gentiles, and there is also the idea of including Gentiles in this world. And my guess is that most of the Gentiles that are addressed in the Gospel of Mark are in any case God-fearers, are in any case people that already had a certain knowledge of the religion of Israel and consider themselves part of the religion of Israel, because Mark, yes, is explaining the things about purification, etc., but he's not explaining things that are more dramatically different from polytheism, like the existence of one God or the presence of the importance of scriptures, etc. So in any case, whoever is reading the Gospel of Mark has a certain knowledge of the religion of Israel and considering themselves part of this community already to a certain extent. But I have a question, very specific question. I mean, because we never mention the testimony of Papias about Mark being an interpreter of Peter. Okay, and I wonder if any of you can say something about these aspects. I mean, what you have done, you are doing in your research of reading the Gospel of Mark within Judaism. Is it coherent with what Papias was saying, that Mark was a disciple, an interpreter of Peter, so in the diaspora, or on the contrary, is telling us something that would lead us to doubt about this kind of reconstruction of the origin of the Gospel of Mark? I know it's a very specific question, but I I wonder if you have any kind of answer to this question.
Does anyone want to address this? Paul, I see your hand up. I assume it has to do with this question.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Isaac just made the point in the chat that Mark has been viewed as the Gospel of Paul, and Hydron and others, by thinking about Paul and Mark together, have done really good work here, and Joel Marcus is, I think, quite good on this in many ways too. The specific thing that I wanted to add, I mean, just coming back to the issue of washings, is that Paul also appeals, just as Mark does. If one reads something like Mark 7 as an encouragement toward the Christian practice of baptism with the Holy Spirit, the baptism that Jesus brings with the Holy Spirit, that then is prelude to inclusion of Gentiles bringing about ritual purity or other things like that. While Paul doesn't make the argument for ritual purity, Paul does argue from his Gentile interlocutors' experience of baptism in Galatians 3 that there is now an inclusion of Gentiles into God's promises and making them sons of Abraham, etc., specifically by the gift of the Holy Spirit. If you take Romans chapter 8 as just as kind of Galatians chapter 3 and then 4 goes to the gift of the Holy Spirit following baptism, you take Romans chapter 8, there's a similar thing where the Holy Spirit is the agent of divine sonship for Gentile participants in Christ. That then moves, this is something Paula brought up at the beginning, but to a sort of huiothesia that is first given to Israel. And so there's a sort of Pauline theology of this Israel first as sons and daughters, and as adopted by God, and now Gentiles, that I do think Mark in many ways plays into this, specifically in the narrative structuring, which is also something that Elizabeth Shively brought up.
Yeah, Hydron?
Yeah, I won't tell you everything about my book, Mark and Paul. You can read it. But since I wrote that, I wanted to add that even if I see that Mark is very close to Paul, I wouldn't say that the Papias, what Papias wrote about Peter could not be the case as well. I mean, we shouldn't think in excluding alternatives. So if he's close to Paul, which I'm very interested to show, he could also have listened to Peter. He could have listened to both in Rome, for example, if I come back to the Rome location, but I don't want to actually decide on that. But if they were there, and so they could have, Mark could have listened to both of them. Just saying, one shouldn't think in excluding alternatives.
I saw a hand from James McGrath before. Is that still a question or no longer?
Well, I put it down because I didn't want to answer the question about Papias on Mark as interpreter of Peter, and so I quickly withdrew it. But something that was just said recently brought me back to something that was part of Hydron's paper. I wonder, how it would affect our consideration of this if we thought about the advantage, priority of Jews and the second-class status of those that are included as a possible way of thinking about this, right? I mean, we talk about the inclusion of the nations, but really what we're talking about is the subjugation of the nations to the one God of Israel. And if we make a conscious effort to use that sort of language and become a bit less skittish about some of the places where Jesus seems to reflect that view of things, I wonder how that would shape our reading of this. And I don't know what terminology would go on that, probably not within Judaism, but there might be something that would fit. But I wonder how that might, because we've been thinking about what things are useful guides and looking at things that do characterize Justin Martyr and others, obviously, therefore cannot serve the purpose that we're looking for. I wonder whether this might be something, precisely the thing that from Justin Martyr onward really gets, downplayed or reinterpreted in radical ways.
I'm seeing 3 hands right now. If any of them are direct responses to what James brought up, jump in. Otherwise, I'll just go in order. Okay. Sarah and then Margaret.
I really appreciate this question. And as I said in my brief 5 minutes, I am very comfortable using a within Judaism approach in Paul studies because of where it comes from, unless I have questions with regards to other texts. But with regards to Paul, I use a within Judaism framework to make the very statement and argument that you're making. I think if we're going to be honest about the capaciousness of Jewishness and thinking about within Judaism, we can't just, I know that we're in a field that has a profoundly disturbing history of anti-Judaism and anti-Jewish racism, and that lingers. But I think it is keeping us from sometimes doing historical, honest work, which is that part of this Jewish messianic expectation is that it is, in a sense, a nationalistic orientation, which I think for Paul, at least, I think Paul sees Jews at the top and Gentiles as just those needed to fulfill this very particular Jewish messianic hope. And so I'm not against using within Judaism to talk about it. I think if we're going to be honest about Jewishness and within Judaism, we have to have these conversations too, and not just try to make Jews good based on modern conceptions of good ethics.
Yeah, and
Margaret?
I think to address both of you, Sarah and James, this is where it's really helpful to compare what Mark is doing to sort of Roman propaganda, because the idea of your ethnos being on top and everybody else being subjugated is not unique to this discussion at all. I mean, that's what Alexander's doing, that's what Rome is doing, that's what Persia was doing, right? There's a very normal way to talk about expansion and empire. And I think one thing, one thing that's limited with the language of Jewishness and Judaism in English is that it sort of puts us over into this religious mindset, right? Where we're just thinking about things sort of cultically and theologically and interpreting things cultically and theologically when maybe they're better interpreted politically, even if they're being framed in sort of a mythological frame. We talk about, even all of this stuff, we talk about all of these things in a Jewish context very differently than we talk about Virgil, even though they're doing very much the same thing, right? This kind of nationalistic propaganda.
This really raises for me the question, which we don't need to address here, but how much our contemporary motives are driving a lot of what we're doing or what our field is doing, but we'll just leave it right there. Juan Carlos?
Thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. I am enjoying a lot. It's a bit difficult to follow the oral discussion on the chat, so I'm trying to do both. So I would like to come back to the question by Gabriele Boccaccini about papayas, because there you also can see a change of the trend. Maybe 50 years ago, the words of papayas were quoted as raw material. This is a very old testimony. Now scholars treat papayas and Justin Martyr and everyone considering them in their own context and with their own agenda. If you read, Enrico Norelli in Italy has studied a lot about papayas, and papayas is defending his own agenda. Anyway, the comparison between Peter and Paul, and Isaac has mentioned Ferdinand Christian Bauer in the chat, I think is very interesting, but it's a false dichotomy, because we have the authentic letters of Paul. We have only made one letter by Peter, so it's very difficult to make a comparison. And we have the Peter of the Gospels, of course, and Acts, but it's very difficult to make a balanced comparison between both of them. And another element of Papaya's text, he says, if I'm not wrong, that Mark has put everything without order, no? And then Matthew came and put everything in order. I really disagree with Papayas. And I think this discussion is showing that there is an outline, there is a progression, there is a plan in the narrative of Mark, and I'm happy to see that maybe we all agree in the importance of chapter 7 and 8, no? and the meaning of the two feedings and all the Syrophoenician woman and all that. The sequence of information is fundamental. You cannot change the order. You are changing the Gospel of Mark. And if you allow me a general remark, what is also fascinating in Mark is its open character. Well, I think Matthew was uncomfortable with Mark because he's so ambiguous sometimes. And Matthew tried to make it more explicit, no? More catechetic, more didactic. And for example, who are Judaioi in Mark? I think we don't know. I mentioned 3 possible interpretations of Mark 7:3, Pantes ho Judaioi. If you look for Judaioi in Mark, you find only Basileus ton Judaion in the Passion narrative, the king of the Jews, and this mentioned in chapter 7. So there's not enough material to determine the meaning. And of course, Judaismos never appears. And Mark has an open ending. So probably if we take a hint from Papayas, Mark as the interpreter of Peter, I would say that Mark is a text that is not enough, it's not self-sufficient. You need a community, you need an oral tradition, you need an explanation. The text is clearly insufficient. We are doing a lot of questions, and I think there are no clear answers in the text.
Thank you. On the topic, or just one contribution on the topic of Peter and Paul, I spent some time in the 19th century literature on Gospel of Mark as Pauline or Petrine. And the thing that struck me was that the people arguing it was, the traditional assumption had always been it was Petrine in some way. Those arguing for that were basically doing it to try to maintain the reliability of it historically, because now you have oral transmission from Peter, and those arguing for that it was Pauline were sort of the slightly more radical ones. Now it's a reworking of gospel traditions for the sake of to make Paul's gospel sort of root that in the life of Jesus. I don't think the same stakes are there today, but that I just found that an interesting little anecdote. And I can second what you're saying about the sort of the how much we don't know and how much we can construct these castles, something that I kind of keep running into. And one thing that strikes me is that one consensus issue I just wanted to point out, at least among those who've expressed it, is that everybody here is arguing that the gospel is written after 70. And I do too. Or I sort of do my whole project, then I'm like, yeah, it just makes more sense then without like an actual, the temple theme to me works better. But you don't know that, like a lot of things. But I mean, so that's just something that we haven't had discussion on. Gabriella, you have your hand up.
No, just to follow up to the discussion about Paul and Peter. Yes, the dichotomy between Paul and Peter belongs to a time in which we wanted to divide between some gospels that were, some writings of the New Testament were more Jewish or less Jewish. Okay. My impression is that the Mark within Judaism, the reading of Mark within Judaism, put Mark very close to Paul as it is written within Judaism. I noticed also when I wrote my book on Paul, my book on Paul, on Paul's the 3 views of path to salvation. I'm also reading Paul within Judaism very, very close to the synoptic tradition and to Mark. So a reading of Paul within Judaism put Paul much closer to the synoptic tradition, because than before, because Paul was considered completely outside and to a certain extent far away from the synoptics. Okay, or influencing the synoptic to move outside of Judaism, with the exception of the Gospel of Mark, that was instead trying to to retake the Gospel tradition within, or better, closer to Judaism. I think that the within Judaism perspective in the reading of the New Testament is completely distracting this kind of binary reading of New Testament text has been less or more Jewish or no longer Jewish, but is pushing us to read all of them as expressions of the apocalyptic form of Judaism. And here I have another question. I mean, we should also probably discuss more the relationship of the Gospel of Mark with Second Temple Jewish literature. I mean, the Psalm of Solomon has been mentioned, but we could mention also the book of Enoch, the animal apocalypse, which means to provide a very close parallel with the inclusion of Gentiles as described in the Gospel of Mark, or the parables of Enoch about the Messiah, the description of the Messiah, Son of Man, and forgiveness of sins, which is a very important element in the parables of Enoch. So reading the Gospel of Mark within Judaism means also reading the Gospel of Mark in close connection with Second Temple Jewish literature. So to emphasize more the connection of his text with the text that were produced at the time in Judaism.
Adrian.
Yes, I want to come back to the date because you just asked that you posed that question, and I'm also convinced that the temple is a very good reason, like Helen said in her paper. So I would definitely go with that. But I also want to connect it with our debate about the food laws again, because I think it's if we think it's written after the destruction of the temple, I think that at least it's pretty probable or plausible that the addressees have in mind the discussion of Peter and Paul, also having spoken about Peter and Paul. I thought that was also a good point of time to bring that argument into this, that if that is in mind, and we hear that Jesus declared all foods clean, that that one hears that as the backdrop, that is a backdrop for listening to that sentence, to understand that sentence, at least in my argumentation, and that also does something with the whole with the feeding miracles, and I think that supports my interpretation. Just wanted to connect that also for the debate to follow. So yes, the temple as a central argument, but the whole food law debate is of course also interesting. The date is interesting for that and relevant for that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the context of the post-70 or slightly pre-70 date certainly gives you all the possibility in the world for it to be writing a gospel with a view of a lot of Gentiles who have become Jesus followers. I wonder if the place of Paul in the canon, where he's just so omnipresent, makes the Gentiles look also everywhere. We don't know, but there's a lot of Paul in the canon, and I just wonder how much we don't know. But I think it's a really good point that we certainly Mark could be writing for Gentiles, or with a view of a lot of Gentiles at 70 or any time around then. Yeah, Isaac?
So, yeah, wonderful panel, great discussion. I'm wanting to maybe bring some of the comments that were raised by Neil Elliott. I understand that perhaps he's not physically present in his office right now, but I did appreciate his contrarian views, and I'm wondering whether we might interact with some of those. Like, for example, the building on this issue of chronology, of the dating of Mark as being usually understood as the earliest gospel, whether we date it slightly before or after 70. How do we deal then with the premise of Matthew and Luke building on Mark and then redacting parts of Mark, such as, this very much discussed verse today, Mark 7:19, the ending, leaving out the ending of 7:19 in the retelling in Matthew 15, for example. Another example, Sabbath observance, Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. Why is that being left out in both Matthew and Luke? If we're following Markan priority, which is the majority. And so that's just a response to Neil Elliott, who I thought provided a very refreshing, stimulating, challenging approach to some of these assumptions. And I'd be curious to hear if anybody has thoughts on that.
Neil is here. Isaac.
Okay. Oh.
Yes.
Hi there. I'm sorry, I was need to get some water as I continue. Thank you for the reference. I do think Mark 7 is one of the places that really encourages me to think in terms of Markan posteriority. It's unusual to expect both Matthew and Luke to leave out both the explanation of what koinos means and the verdict that Jesus declared all foods clean. They very neatly cooperate to exclude just those pieces that seem to be important for Mark. And our earlier discussion, as various people have talked around Mark 7, it seems to me very unusual that anyone would have to explain to any particular Jew anywhere in the world what koinos meant or what the purity laws required, and to do it in vague, generalized terms like, well, Jews wash their hands a lot and Jews wash pots and pans. Mark starts out saying, Mark's Jesus starts out saying, the Pharisees do that, and then almost offhandedly says, well, all the Jews. And at that point, I think he's clearly talking to a Gentile readership. He expects other Jews not to be paying attention at that point.
One quick thing just to add to what Neil is saying is I think some of Jesus' disciples are also washing their hands. I don't know that this solves anything, but the story says that some of the disciples weren't. So I think a lot of them were. And the issue might be a restrictive type of expectation legislation, the issue, but it's not as if there's a complete separation in practice. Just a side comment. Yeah, Juan?
Thank you. I think this problem of the order of the composition of the Gospels reminds us of the hermeneutical presuppositions we have when interpreting a text. For a very long period, we had, but we still keep some of that, of the romantic worldview of the research of the seeds in Leben, the Hermann Gunkel and many other people. They were great scholars, but they had the presupposition that we had to be able to reconstruct the precise circumstances of composition of a text in order to understand it. I think that we have to assume that we will never know which gospel was written first. And I think that Mark's presentation was interesting in which it's provoking, it's refreshing, I don't think that Mark was written after, but it's really useful to consider that. And the famous Q source, and now we have Mark Goodacre, who is leading a campaign against Q. I am not leading any campaign, but it's also refreshing to read Luke thinking that he knew Matthew. But remember that we don't know, so maybe he didn't know. But it's because at the end we have to read the text, and these theories shed new light on how to read them. But we don't, I repeat, we will never know. After 200 years of scholarship, I think we should give up more or less, and maybe there are new nuances, but it's really difficult. But the usefulness of all these theories is this refreshing of our way of reading the same text. That's all.
Thank you. Isaac.
Yeah, I share the skepticism of Juan Carlos. I mean, in the first monograph, Torah Praxis, as a PhD student, I was just going with the flow, and it was the two-source hypothesis, which I think had a stronger, established opinion in the academy than it does now. But I've become very skeptical. For me, all the options are on the table as far as the synoptic problem is concerned. That said, Mark 7:19b, after reading John von Maren's work and also Logan Williams, it really has led me to consider how to reevaluate passages in Matthew that are or Luke that are in parallel with Mark, and not to think of them as like, well, we're redacting this because we're worried that Mark's gospel might misleadingly indicate that Torah practice doesn't matter anymore, right? That's often how, for example, the Matthean redaction of Mark 7:19b is explained. So in Matthew 15, Matthew left that out because Matthew was worried that it would lead to the idea that the dietary laws, kashrut, so to speak, has been abolished. I think now we have to come back and rethink those a prioris if we accept the argument that, in fact, in Mark 7, it's not about dietary laws. And I don't think it's about dietary laws. I think it stays strictly within the realm of purity. And it's not about whether one has to keep purity, but how one keeps certain purity laws. And so that's been refreshing. And that applies to other passages like Mark 2:27, perhaps in Matthew 12 and in Luke 6. The reason why that statement is not there is more for Christological reasons. It's really to draw attention to the fact that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath and not just any human being willy-nilly. So just wanted to respond to what's been said there. Thank you.
Paul.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Isaac. I'm really with you there, and I think another parallel that we might point to is Luke 11:37-41, just specifically for Mark 7. Pharisees asked Jesus to dine with them. They note that Jesus was not first baptized before the dinner, hoti ou proton evaptisti, protu aristu. And Jesus then gets into conversation contrasting cleaning, katharizo, the outside versus cleaning the inside, to exothen and to esothen. And then Jesus, who here sounds a lot like Luke, commands giving ta enonta, the inner things, as alms, and then concludes with, behold, all things are clean for you or to you, idu panta kathara humin estin. The thing that I'm thinking about here is that both the concern with baptism and a sort of this softens in some ways the declaring all foods clean, but and in some ways circumscribes it by saying, for you all things are clean. Therefore, for those perhaps, if we're speaking about members of the community who have had baptism with the Holy Spirit or something like that. I mean, this is obviously my thesis that I keep hitting, so forgive me. But if this is what's going on, there's a certain this sounds in some ways like the pastorals, to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, their conscience is defiled. Not to say that that's Pauline, but just to say that this is a way of thinking about those who are inside, those who are outside. who are perhaps able, this is where I differ a little bit with Logan Williams. It's not so much that the digestive process is purifying the foods, but that there may be a force within certain people, those, I would posit perhaps baptized by the Holy Spirit, that is producing a sort of ritual purification from within, that might be, not abrogating the Torah, in fact, keeping its designations of what is pure, what is impure, what is permitted, what is not permitted, but that is kind of rendering it not as effective, or operating for those who have a new force kind of doing the cleansing. That dances Mark, I think, on the outskirts of Judaism. If you think about this as a sort of liminal space, and kind of puts him more into kind of articulating something new. But I think what I wanted to highlight in our discussion today is that he's doing it with Jewish categories, derived specifically from Jewish authoritative texts, and not negating its terminology of pure or impure, and is still thinking about that, even if he may be moving in some ways beyond it. And that I think Luke is doing a very similar thing, is my point, with this, but tamps down some of Mark's harsher edges, perhaps.
We only have 10 more minutes. I see in the chat, Isaac has raised the question of the trial scene, especially which relates to Laura Pizarro's presentation and Helen Bond's. And I'm wondering if there are questions about those. Also, if other panelists have questions or comments or contributions to any of this, who we haven't heard from yet. I want to make space for them right now. How about comments on the trial scene? One question I have about the trial scene is it does mention the crowds, right? The Jewish leaders instigate, but then the crowds are in some way responsible for ensuring that Pilate has Jesus crucified. What do you do with, so if you wanted to be just the leaders, what do you do with the inclusion of the crowds there? Yeah, Helen?
Well, I think that kind of proves it in a way, because it's very much the aristocratic leaders who whip up the crowd. The crowd come demanding the usual custom, and you are prepared as a reader to expect that they're going to be on the side of Jesus, because they have been up till now. They've been very positive at the triumphal entry, and then you have the aristocratic leaders telling them to shout for Barabbas. I mean, they succeed, so you could say, well, maybe the crowd were a bit weak, but when your leaders tell you this is what you have to do, I think that's, again, that so Mark does say in the end, yeah, it was, but then he has everybody turning against Jesus. I mean, it's just a series of, the disciples run away, the naked guy runs away, the crowd runs away, even God seems like he's deserted him at the end, and this just seems to be a Markan theme that the Jewish people fit into. But I would say overall, I mean, it's pretty clear that it's the leaders who push them into it.
And it strikes me that the crowds are pretty fickle throughout Mark. They flock to Jesus and then they want to crucify him, and so they don't seem to be really characterized in a way where they're acting sort of as one and with some sort of like intention. They're just kind of this group that goes after whatever's new or whatever the new thing is, I think. And so here it's the leaders who are able to sort of prick them, and then they do the get Jesus thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I suppose you could also say that individual Jews are generally portrayed in a positive way. People who come to Jesus for healing or exorcising, they are are generally positive. I mean, even if, yes, the crowd can be a little fickle, though I think generally it's pretty positive. But my sense is that it is very much the leaders who are the ones who are, turning against Jesus. It's the aristocratic leaders in Jerusalem. It's the scribes who come from Jerusalem. It's the Pharisaic leaders in Galilee at times. But it's very much the leaders rather than the ordinary people, it seems to me.
Nathaniel?
This is just a second Helen's point. There's a very close similarity to how Josephus depicts the fall of Jerusalem. The crowds play a big role in this as well, but they're largely victims of these tyrants who exploit them and often kill them. But at the same time, they're sort of held responsible for the entire situation of the city. So Josephus is also a bit ambiguous about who's to blame. He ultimately thinks it's the zealots, but kind of everyone in Jerusalem's responsible to an extent. So I think both fit very nicely into sort of the post-70. Why did Jerusalem fall? Well, it's obviously these figures, the priests from Mark, the zealots, and these other figures for Josephus, but the whole city's caught up in it. And this is very key to explaining, well, why didn't God just destroy the priests? The whole city was destroyed. So it's very much part of this argument.
We have just a couple minutes left. I want to remind everyone who's still with us that there's a document with a link in the chat to relevant publications from all the panelists in some way related to our talk today. Maybe, Megan, if you could share it again, just so that it's easily accessible to anybody who's interested. Also, a fair number of people here are working on other projects, which are forthcoming and also relevant. And so I think there's a lot of good stuff coming out. Are there any last questions? Otherwise,
no, just a final comment from me on behalf of a seminar. I would really like to thank all of you for participating in this lively debate. I mean, we can no longer say that Mark is not part of a within Judaism conversation, because the panel of today has demonstrated that there is a group of scholars, distinguished scholars, that is actually discussing this perspective with, I think, very interesting results for our understanding of the Gospel of Mark and his relationship with the other Gospels, and also with Paul. So I thank you very, very much once again for this conversation. I want to thank all the many people that have attended this meeting until the last moment. And also I would like to remind you that tomorrow we will start this conversation again with James McGrath, Isaac Oliver, John Van Maren, and another panelist of today that would like to join us. A 30 minutes wrap-up question of the recap session. Okay, recap session of the most important elements that we have discussed today. And after, this will be at 9:30, and instead at 10:30, we'll have our final panel that will be about the book of Revelation within Judaism. And this will be the end of our 3-day marathon on that we will continue on September mid-September with another round of tests. I mean, personally, for me, claiming that Paul, Mark, Matthew, and Luke should be read within Judaism at this point seems quite obvious. Of course, with all the caveats of the term Judaism. So reading this term as part of the diversity of the Jewish religion in the Second Temple period, the first century, seems to me quite obvious. I think that the biggest questions are about the end of the first century with the Gospel of John and other texts, and just in order to understand when a conversation, a controversy that comes from within the family became a controversy that instead was presented from outside of Judaism. Thank you again to all people that have attended, and see you tomorrow.